quote any additional case law, would rely, as mentioned in the motion itself, on everything that I've argued under my motion for an anonymous jury. But did notice media, and they are here to respond. I think you understand my position on it. I won't reiterate it unless you need me to, but I think it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, thank you. Does the state have any response they want to make before I get to Mr. Pons and Ms. Fugate?
We would concur with the need to keep the jurors' names and other biographical information anonymous as long as possible.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Pons?
Yes, Your Honor. Scott Ponce on behalf of the media organizations identified in our papers. If Your Honor has to rule on this motion today, the motion should be denied. There's nothing in the record before you establishing or even suggesting that there's any risk of harm to anyone who might serve on this jury. Nor is there anything in front of you, Your Honor, to say that 6 months is the length of a cooling off period that's necessary. Why isn't 1 week good enough? Why isn't 2 weeks good enough? We've really got the cart before the horse here. I believe we're being premature in trying to determine how long a cooling off period do we need in order for something that may or may not happen to blow over. We just don't know. It's all conjecture and speculation. If Your Honor has to rule on this today, I think the best thing is to set a 1 week cooling off period. And we'll come back a week after the verdict's announced, and we can take up the issue of what's happened in that week. Is there a need to keep names of jurors anonymous any longer, or has nothing happened? Have the fears that mentioned in defendant's motion not materialized such that there's no harm in letting the names go? I think it's premature right now to say that for 6 months these have to be secret. Let's come back a week after. If you don't want to deny the motion, let's come back a week after the verdict, see what's happened, and see if there's any need for further anonymity. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Fugate, unless Your Honor has any more questions.
I don't have any questions. Thank you.
I'll be very brief, Your Honor. We filed a response that had some of the case law about access to jurors' names to the previous motion. We stand by that in the cases cited therein. There have been many attempts in Florida to change the law applicable to jurors, from the post-Newsweek case to the general presumption that their identities eventually come out, and they've all been unsuccessful. We don't think there's any reason that Mr. O'Mara's motion has presented any definite reason to change that. But agree with Mr. Ponce that at this point it's just simply premature. We don't know what the outcome of this case is going to be. We don't know what public perception is going to be of it or what the public reaction is going to be. I think it would be impossible at this juncture to make the necessary findings about whether a cooling off period was warranted, and if so, how long. In the Casey Anthony case, that decision came after the verdict was rendered based upon evidence of the judge took judicial notice of some threats against the jurors for a cooling off period that was actually half as much as Mr. O'Mara is requesting here. So I just think at this point we don't have the evidence and the necessary basis to make any determination about whether it's warranted, and if so, the length.
Okay, thank you very much. Any further argument?
Just brief response. I'm not certain that the media attorneys had the specific benefit of hearing from at least 3 jurors who we questioned who had concerns, significant concerns over maintaining their anonymity, potential safety concerns with an unfavorable verdict, however unfavorable is defined by those who believe it to be unfavorable. So I am concerned. I was going to suggest that I agree with Mr. Ponce that we come back in a certain period of time. I was going to say we come back in a year, but I thought that might be a touch too long.
Here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to grant the motion but reserve it to the amount of time. So I'll make that determination at a later time. But the keeping their names anonymous for some time will be granted. I just will reserve it to
Thank you.
time.
I'll draft an order if you'd like for that.
I could just do one.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Are we ready to begin the testimony for the balance? Yes, you may. Thank you very much. Mr. West, do you have your witness ready?
It's my understanding that he is available through video link.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, if I might be excused, Mr. West is going to hold this.
Yes, you may. Thank you.
Dr. Wayman, can you hear us? Let's try that again. Can you hear us, Dr. Wayman?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Very good. Just give us one more second. We're about to start.
Could you announce the name of the witness, please?
Yes, Your Honor. The next witness is Dr. James L. Wayman, spelled W-A-Y-M-A-N.
Did you say doctor or Mr.?
I said doctor.
Okay, Dr. Wayman, can you please raise your right hand to be sworn in by the clerk?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that you will testify truthfully in this proceeding? So help you God?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Okay, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Wayman, if you would introduce yourself to the court and let us know if we're having any transmission issues. Can you see and hear us at this time?
I can see you and hear you very well. My name is James Lewis Wayman.
And you've been introduced as Dr. James Wayman. Do you hold a doctorate degree?
Yes, sir. I received a PhD in acoustical engineering from the University of California at Santa Barbara in 1980.
Would you describe briefly what acoustical engineering is?
There are several branches, or many branches of acoustical engineering. In my particular case, I was concerned with the acoustic transmission in spaces, the transmission of sound through air from a speaker to a receiver, a loudspeaker perhaps to a microphone, or a human speaker to a microphone. My particular dissertation was on the effects of the environment, specifically the reflective surfaces, on the transmission between speaker and microphone.
I take it you're saying not the act of speech itself by the speaker, but what happens to the speech after it leaves the mouth of the person that said it?
That's correct. I'm interested in how sound is transmitted in spaces. At least that was my original interest when I wrote my PhD thesis some 33 years ago.
Do you also hold a master's level degree?
I did my master's thesis. I completed that in 1977, also from University of California, Santa Barbara, and that was on exactly the same topic. I did a more reduced study of the transmission of sound in spaces.
And you also hold an undergraduate degree in a related field?
That was in mechanical engineering. At the time that I was studying acoustics, vibration and acoustics was considered part of mechanical engineering.
You mentioned your dissertation about trying to understand what happens to speech from the person that speaks it until it is received, I take it, through a microphone or the airwaves to the microphone, etc. Were you analyzing this aspect of acoustical engineering orally with a computer? What was your approach?
I wrote a computer program to predict the distribution of sound in a reflective or semi-reflective enclosure between a microphone and a speaker where the two were placed at different positions. So let's imagine then that I wrote a computer model of the room you're standing in, and we could place the speaker any place in the room, the microphone any place in the room, and get a pretty good idea of what the acoustic response would be relating the speaker to the microphone based on the reflectivity and location of the various surfaces in the room.
And are you familiar with the mathematics involved in developing such a program?
Yes, in fact, mathematics was a minor field, and my first job after writing that dissertation and getting my PhD was as a professor of mathematics, in fact, for the U.S. Navy at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, where I taught math to Navy officers seeking master's degrees and PhDs.
More specifically, do you have a background in the development of algorithms with reference to speaker recognition?
Yes. While I was working at the Naval Postgraduate School in the Department of Mathematics as a research professor, I began to take an interest in automated speaker recognition technologies. My background was exactly right. The timing was exactly right. There were great advances being made in computers, in analog to digital conversion systems, and I fit right into this whole business of trying to create computer programs that could recognize persons from their speech.
Has that later become known as automated speaker recognition?
It was known as automated speaker recognition at the time. It is still known as automated speaker recognition. And throughout the 80s and into the 1990s, I worked for the U.S. Department of Defense developing algorithms to do exactly that.
We've used a lot of different terms over the course of these proceedings. Are you talking about, when you talk about automated speaker recognition, part of a larger field known as biometrics?
Since 1980, that has been true. We're jumping ahead a bit in my resume, but for the last 12 years, I've worked for the British government in the area of standards development, and my primary focus here has been on the development of standards for vocabulary. And so I can speak very precisely from the international standards on the definition of biometrics in this case, if you would like. I don't know if you want to go into that level of detail or not.
Well, before we do, let's talk a little bit more sequentially. As you were developing the algorithms for speaker recognition, did you apply for and do you hold any patents in this area?
I hold a total of 4 patents in the area of human language technology. Not all of those patents pertain to speaker recognition, although 2 of them do. 2 of the patents pertain to speech compression technologies, which I think you've already discussed at some length, perhaps with Dr. Nakasone.
Would you summarize, since we're talking about positions that you've held since obtaining your PhD, you talked about the Department of Defense. Was that your first position after receiving your degree?
Yes, I worked as a professor. I had 2 different titles. I was an adjunct professor and a research professor of mathematics at the Naval Postgraduate School, and then I became a contractor to the U.S. Department of Defense, specifically in this area of speaker recognition. That broadened out by the early 1990s into other areas of automated human recognition, so that my interests were slightly broader by the time we got into the early 1990s.
Have you worked as a researcher at the Los Alamos National Laboratory?
That's correct. I had a visiting researcher appointment while I was on the faculty of the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School.
Have you also worked as a consulting scientist for the Ford Aerospace and Communications Corporation?
That's exactly true. That's where I did the work that became later patented, and Ford Aerospace owns the rights to those patents.
Likewise, have you been a senior scientist with Vitro, Tracor, Blair, and Associates?
Yes, sir. The reason those are 3 different names is our group, which was called the Technical Security Laboratory, was sequentially sold or spun off into those different groups.
Have you as well been the director of the United States National Biometric Test Center at the College of Engineering?
Yes, sir. In 1997, the U.S. government established, through the Department of Defense, the U.S. National Biometric Test Center. We reported to the Security Policy Board, who reported to the National Security Advisor, who in turn reported to the President of the United States. During that 3.5-year period, I was director of the laboratory.
And while some of these may overlap as we go, have you also been a consultant to the RAND Corporation?
Yes, sir. I was a staff consultant in the area of biometrics to the RAND Corporation in the several years in the early part of the 2000s.
Are you at this time affiliated with San Jose State University?
That's right. I'm a research administrator in the Office of Research and Graduate Studies at San Jose State University in San Jose, California. I was previously in the College of Engineering.
How long have you held your current position, and what are your general duties and responsibilities?
I've been at San Jose State University since 1995, and I transferred out of the out of the College of Engineering into the Office of Graduate Studies and Research about 2000. Currently, I'm under contract through the university, as I said, to the British government, to the state of California, and for several years to the Department of Defense. I'm currently under contract to the Department of Defense, but the contract is no longer handled through the university. So my work now is primarily in standards development for biometrics in general, for helping governments procure large-scale biometric systems, and also I teach a week-long course to various governments around the world in the fundamentals of automated human recognition.
We'll get to that in more detail in a moment. Let's touch upon a little bit, though, more of your history and background in this area. When you say that you are under contract with these entities, what is it that you are doing with regard to them, if it's the same thing or specifically with each of the agencies?
With all of these national governments and agencies, the fundamental topic is automated human recognition technologies. And also the testing, and fundamentally the testing of those automated human recognition technologies. So for every agency or government, the work is somewhat different. I currently work for the government of Australia, Australia Customs and Border Protection. They have a border crossing system based on facial recognition technology. I have helped them evaluate that technology. I've created for them evaluation plans. My work for the British government is twofold. I help them develop international standards through the ISO, International Organization for Standards, Subcommittee 37 for biometrics. And I also help them organize quarterly biometrics meetings for the British government. We had just such a meeting today, in fact, here in London.
Where are you now?
I'm in London.
Are you based out of San Jose? That's where your full-time position is with the university?
That's correct, sir.
Does your work call upon you to travel extensively within the scientific community?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Touch upon, if you would, briefly. You know, Your Honor, let me stop for a moment. I'm sorry. I'm not sure if the court has Dr. Wayman's CV. I apologize. I have a copy. May I?
Do you want to introduce it into evidence?
Yes.
Any objections? No, Your Honor. It'll come in as defense exhibit number 4.
I'm sorry, Judge. I'm choosing to follow along this way. Dr. Wayman, I apologize to you as well. I failed to provide the court until just now with a copy of your CV. So if we touch upon something that you'd like to point out, you can simply indicate by the page number or paragraph. I do want, though, to talk with you about your publications. Would you describe in general the kinds of areas that you have been published and the way that you typically are published?
There are several types of publications. Of course, the most prestigious is in a peer-reviewed journal, and I have a dozen or 2 dozen papers in peer-reviewed journals. I have one paper appearing this month and one paper appearing in September. Both of those papers are, I think, relevant to the case. The first paper that appears this month in the IET Biometrics Journal is about the new international standard for vocabulary in biometrics. And the paper that will appear in September is co-authored. I'm the principal author. The co-authors are the chief of the Division of Statistics at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and also the third author is a senior statistician at the National Physical Lab here in London. And that paper, if I'm remembering the title correctly, is a mathematical and a modern mathematical and philosophical approach to uncertainty estimation in biometric device performance. That's what it is.
Have you also edited books in the area of biometrics?
Yes, I was the principal editor on Wayman, Jane Maltonian, Mayo biometric systems, algorithms, applications, and theory algorithms and applications. That was published by Springer Publications in 2005. It is currently out of print. I think we sold about 2,000 copies, but it's available online last time I checked, and you can download that, I think, for free.
Do some of the chapters in that book reference speaker recognition?
Yes, 2 of the chapters in the book reference speaker recognition. The chapter on the technology of speaker recognition was written by Herb Gish of Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, BBN, and the chapter on testing was had several co-authors, including co-authors from Lincoln Laboratory and also National Institute of Standards and Technology.
As well, do you routinely present to select groups around the world in the area of speaker identification?
Absolutely, that's true. I have a 5-day course I teach for governments around the world. I taught it most recently for the U.S. Defense Department and FBI back in February, and we spend close to a full day on techniques for automated speaker recognition, the inherent mathematics, and how those technologies work and what the testing results show.
Typically, who is in attendance at your presentations? What types?
All types. I taught the course for 10 years at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, as an extension course. We got lots of LA County sheriffs there. So I frequently get LA County sheriffs, but on the other hand, I often get faculty members from other universities that want to create courses in automated human recognition technologies. They come and spend a week with me, and that kickstarts them in terms of the available literature, the format that such a class might have, projects that their students can do. And so I would say that almost everyone that takes my class has a college degree of some sort. That's not strictly true. And that very often, quite frequently, in fact, we'll have PhDs take the course who have, in fact, been practicing in the field.
Have you presented on trying to explain the mathematics behind automated speaker recognition systems?
Yes, I want to be a little bit careful, though, about answering that question, because the majority of people that take this class may have had in the dark, distant past some familiarity with mathematics, but when they come to the course, I cannot expect them to remember much more than, say, high school arithmetic and algebra. I don't even expect them to remember high school trigonometry. So we kind of review these concepts as we go along. I try to present a lot of pictures. I do a lot of hand waving or body movements to try to express some of the time functions. And I'd like to believe that I've been pretty successful in communicating ideas that can be difficult to understand when written as mathematical formula, but become much more intuitive if they can be seen as pictures or body movements.
As well, have you participated in direct research funding?
Oh, yes. I don't even know where to start on that. I've been funded to develop test standards for biometrics, to test biometrics, to develop biometrics. Yes, and yes.
Are those projects listed in more detail in the CV?
Not all of them. I listed a few of the selected projects in the CV. There got to be so many, and the CV was getting too long. I thought, well, nobody really is concerned with the individual projects that have been funded.
Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about some editorial work that you did with a book. Have you also been the editor of various professional journals and such?
Yes, that's true. I've been on editorial boards. I've never served in the capacity of chief editor-in-chief of a journal, but I've been on and am on numerous editorial boards, and I've been a guest editor of a number of special issues. in various journals, always concerning automated human recognition technology.
In looking over your CV, I see lots of acronyms, some of which may be readily apparent and some of which may not. So let me ask you about the IEEE. Are you familiar with that organization?
Yes, sir. That's the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. It's an international institute based, I believe, in New York, but in any case, in the United States, that has a broad remit. And much of what we do in acoustics and in automated speaker recognition is now within the remit of the IEEE, as we call it.
Tell me a little bit more about that and what role you have with that organization.
Well, I'm a fellow in that organization, and a fellow is basically the highest rank of membership. They have numerous journals, and I would say my biggest well, I'm a distinguished lecturer. Let me say that. I'm proud of that, of course, and thank you to the IEEE for making. That's a 2-year appointment, and I happen to have it. This is my 2nd year, and I also spend a great deal of time reviewing for their various journals and reviewing for their technical conferences and speaking at their technical conferences as well.
Let's touch upon some of the work that you've done and the interests that you've had over time. Should you have something related to your specific background or training that we touch upon, please indicate that if that might be of some help to understand your perspective. When I was talking with you a few minutes ago, you said that there was a time when your interests in automated human recognition by computers expanded into other areas of biometrics.
That's correct. This came about in conversations with the Department of Defense while I was working on speaker recognition technologies. At that time, they said, you know, Jim, what we'd really like is someone to spend more time looking at the scientific basis of broader forms of human recognition. For instance, at that time, retinal recognition, face recognition, fingerprint recognition, hand geometry recognition, iris recognition had not quite come along yet. And they said, we'd like someone to take a strong look at the scientific basis for these technologies and how one might test these technologies to determine their reliability. At that time, there were no standard testing. And I developed the speaker recognition system, but I didn't have any guidance as to how it should be tested. I realized that there were a million ways I could test these things, some of which would be prejudiced in my favor, some of which would be prejudiced against me. I didn't have any guidelines to tell me what a fair method of assessment would be for any human recognition technology. The Department of Defense recognized this, and they asked me to get more generally involved in biometrics and in biometric testing in particular.
How would you define biometrics then?
We have, as I mentioned, a brand new international standard called ISO IEC, where IEC means International Electrotechnical Commission. That standard is number 2382, part 37. And in that standard, it defines biometrics in this particular application is the automated recognition of individuals based on their behavioral and biological traits. By individuals, we mean human individuals, and further, we acknowledge that there are other communities within biology that have a much broader definition of biometrics. When we say biometrics in this sense, we're talking simply about automated human recognition technologies. We do not take away the ability of any other group to use biometrics in any other meaning they wish.
In that regard, then, is automated speaker recognition part of that larger group of biometric technology?
Absolutely, because automated speaker recognition tries to recognize individuals based on both biological and behavioral traits. I think you've discussed a little of that with witnesses in the past. We believe that speech is a behavior, but we believe also it's biologically conditioned, that there are parts of my speech production mechanism that are being assessed when we do automated speaker recognition, a biology behind this.
I know that from your CV in about 1997, you became director of the U.S. National Biometric Test Center. Would you talk about what that is and what your role was?
Yes, the Department of Defense thought that biometric technologies had advanced to the point that a test center should be developed, not really knowing what we wanted to do at the time, and being very concerned that we had no standards developed for testing. One of the first things we did is we developed some standards for testing biometrics in general, and then we conducted a number of large-scale tests of, for instance, hand geometry being used in the Immigration and Naturalization Service border crossing system. We worked with the Philippine government to test fingerprinting for use in their Social Security system. We did a data collection effort on iris images for iris testing, and we wrote a whole number of papers on the nature of fingerprinting and some statistics of correlating finger patterns between fingers and error rates for various algorithms and those types of things.
This is an idea of being able, with some reliability, to identify a specific individual by some semi-unique or unique characteristic or combination of characteristics?
That's true, that's correct. I don't like to use the word unique because it has some philosophical problems. For instance, unique is disjunctive. We can't say unique or less unique. Either it is or it isn't. I like to use the word distinctive. So we look at distinctive traits, some of which are more distinctive, some of which are less distinctive. Sometimes we combine them. Always the goal is to recognize individuals, meaning human bodies, by their biological and behavioral characteristics.
And that applies equally to trying to identify a speaker by his or her voice.
Absolutely. If we're trying to do that using automated technology, using computers.
Are there particular challenges in identifying speakers by their voice as compared with, for example, DNA?
Well, I'm not an expert on DNA, and I know that there's certain difficulties involved with DNA as well, but there's such a strong behavioral component to speech, both a willful and a involuntary component to speech, that controlling the behavior of the speaker in a way that we can get reproducible sounds is absolutely a challenge. Remember, in all of these technologies, the challenge is to reduce the within-speaker variability. That is to get me, for instance, to say things in a repeatable way, while at the same time to expand or exaggerate the between-speaker variability. That is to encourage me to speak in a way that is quite different from you, and to take measurements of my speech that will be quite different from you, so that my voice can be distinguished through distinctive characteristics from your voice, meaning that we can tell the difference between you and me when we speak.
We were talking about the National Biometric Test Center, for which you were a director until about year 2000. Who funded that test center? And
it was funded by the U.S. Department of Defense.
That was part of what you were talking before about working for as a consultant with the Department of Defense?
No. I guess I've had so many roles with the Defense Department, we're getting them confounded a little bit. I was a consultant for the Defense Department between the time I left the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School and the time that I started biometrics research at San Jose State University, which was in 1995. And then in 1997, as an employee of San Jose State University, I became director of the U.S. National Biometric Test Center, which was funded by the U.S. Department of Defense, which was the answer to your original question.
I see, thank you. You mentioned that you have an interest in and a background in developing standards for biometrics. Could you talk about that a minute?
Yes, I absolutely will. The question then in founding the U.S. National Biometric Test Center was, how shall we test? How shall we test in a way that's repeatable, meaning if we run the same test again, we'll get basically the same answers. How do we run a test in a way that's reproducible? Meaning if our lab shows results, will another lab run the same test and get same results? These are very difficult questions. And then thirdly, we want our tested results to be relevant to applications in the field. And that's yet a harder question. So we spent a good deal of our time developing standards for the tests that we were also creating. And then I know we're getting on to the next story a little bit, but by the year 2000, San Jose State University was funded by the British government, and we've been under funding now for 13 years, specifically to develop international standards for testing biometric systems, and that's what I've been involved in for the last 13 years, as well as the development of international standards for a vocabulary to express what it is we do when we do automated human recognition technology.
I'm a little confused when you say the development of the standards for vocabulary. What do you mean by vocabulary in this context?
Well, I have listened to a number of a number of hours of the proceeding, both live and on recording that you've been going through in the last few weeks. And I've noticed an inconsistency the way the various people involved use certain terms. So often we talk past each other because when we use a term, we don't mean it in the same way. And then there's confusion when we ask someone a question and the person doesn't understand the sense in which the term is being used. If we can develop specific meanings for specific terms of art in biometrics, it will make communication that much clearer and more easy for all of us.
Is that ongoing work of yours?
It's ongoing work of ours. Again, this is work done by the International Organization of Standards and International Electrotechnical Committee, Standards Committee 37. I am simply one member of that committee. I happen to be the what they call the principal UK expert on that committee, and I've fostered that work for the last 13 years, but by no means is this my work alone. It involved an international committee of maybe as many as 20 people working over a 13-year period. We just published the first draft, the first final standard last November, and we are continuing developing words. We had a conference 2 months ago in which we added additional terms to our lexicon. This is a lifetime activity. We'll be doing this for the next 13 years, I'm sure.
Is there a particular interest in this type of work in the United Kingdom? Is that why you've been there so much?
Absolutely. The U.S., in fact, does not participate in the development of vocabulary for biometrics. I can't tell you why that is. That was a choice of the U.S. national body not to participate. But I would say that the U.S., Canadian, and Australian and German governments have played a leading role. And I know some of my French, Italian, and Japanese friends are going to be upset that I didn't mention them as well. Russians also were heavily involved. I shouldn't start mentioning the countries that were involved because so many of them were involved, and those that I didn't mention will feel snubbed.
Does this group have regular meetings?
Absolutely. Until the meeting in April, we were meeting twice a year for 1 week. We met 5 consecutive days twice a year. Starting in April, we've dropped the schedule back to a 9-month schedule, but there's been some pushback on that. And at the meeting we had in April, which happened to be here in the UK, I think a motion was advanced to move us back to a twice-a-year schedule and not and get us off of this 9-month schedule. Right now, I can't answer your question very clearly. The situation is a little bit fluid, but historically, from 2002 until 2012, we met twice a year for 1 week meeting.
Dr. Wayman, you had used the acronym NIST earlier today, and I know you've heard that in other testimony. Would you take just a moment, please, and tell us what NIST is and what role you have in that program?
Prior to about 1982, I believe, NIST was known as the National Bureau of Standards. It's now known as the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. I have had a very long and convolved relationship with NIST. Let me just tell you a few of my roles. Currently, I serve as the technical assessor for their National Voluntary Laboratory Assessment Program. We assess labs and certify them to do testing of biometric systems. But also in the past, I served on a National Academy of Science committee that was in charge of oversight of the work within the Information Technology Laboratory of the National Institute of standards and technology. And let me make it perfectly clear. I did that job before I have my current job with NIST, so at that time there was no conflict of interest. Certainly now I could not have a job overseeing and reporting to Congress on the status of scientific projects at NIST because I work for them. But I've had that relationship with them. And currently I've worked side by side with them on a number of projects, and I'm doing one now, in fact, on the development of a voice data record, we call it, for use of voice data in forensic applications. I serve on committees with these people. We're all serving in the same committee working on the development of this voice standard for the transmission of voice data for forensic applications.
Dr. Wayman, you mentioned that a role you played was in assessing laboratories for certification. Would you speak more directly to that? When you mean a laboratory, what is it that you're talking about, and how would they become certified in the area of, did you say speaker recognition?
There is not currently an international standard for speaker recognition. There's one under development, and I'm the editor. I'm afraid I'm causing some confusion here. There are two standards under development for speaker recognition data format. One is being developed on the international level, and one is being developed for forensic applications in conjunction with NIST. I'm the editor of both of those standards. So to answer your question specifically, when a laboratory wants to be certified, they come to NIST and ask to be certified with respect to some standards. And because there currently is no standard for speaker recognition, they cannot be certified in speaker recognition because there's nothing to certify them to. So here's how to answer your question. If you're still interested in your question, I still am, and I will complete the answer to the question. Are you still interested in the question?
You mentioned that you were involved in the process for assessing and certifying labs. I think you've just said there really are no accepted standards specifically in the area of speaker recognition, but that's ongoing work. Did I summarize that correctly?
I think that's true. When I'm talking, the standards I'm talking about are for data format, data exchange, and such things as best practices for collection of speech data. We do not have those standards. We're working to develop those standards. A number of groups are working to develop those standards. We've been working for a number of years. We want to go in that direction. We're trying hard.
You also, I think, if I caught this correctly, have a role with NIST I'm sorry, it's so confusing to me, I apologize. You said, I think, forensic applications? Maybe you could help us understand the role.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So we've talked a little bit about the international standards, but there's a different group of standards. These are called the American National Standards Institute, ANSI/NIST, ITL, Information Technology Laboratory Standards, for the transmission of forensic information, including facial information, including fingerprint information, including scar, mark, and tattoo information, including iris information, including DNA information, and we're developing two new standards, one for speech information and one for bite mark and dental information. And I think I've probably forgotten some of the record types. I think that's probably only a partial accounting of all the different types of forensic information that can be transmitted and stored using this current standard. And when I say transmitted and stored, I also mean the transmission and storage of the metadata, the data that tells you the conditions under which the data was collected. And so that's an ANSI NIST standard. I'm working with NIST, as I said, as editor of the Type 11 record for forensic data collection and transmission. Forensic speech data collection and transmission.
You know, we heard from Dr. George Doddington about NIST and the evaluation programs that NIST sponsors, where speaker identification individuals, companies, and groups can submit to a voluntary testing for proficiency. Are you familiar with that program?
Yes, I'm familiar with that program, but I myself have never entered an algorithm for testing in that program. When I was developing speaker recognition algorithms before that program came around. Probably by 1994, the program started in 1996, incidentally, but by 1994, I was no longer actively involved in developing my own automated speaker recognition algorithms, having moved on to the areas of testing and standards development.
Let's talk a little bit, if we can, about sort of the history and evolution of speaker recognition. Are you familiar with the methods in which speaker recognition has been attempted over the last 40 or 50 years?
Actually, over the last 70 years. Yes, indeed, I am. I'm a bit of a history buff when it comes to my own profession of automated human recognition technologies, and I've done my best to understand where they came from. Most of them will be traced to the early computers of the 1960s, but in the case of speaker recognition, we have a very interesting situation in that we can trace the origins to the analog computer work that was done during World War II, particularly by Bell Laboratories, Bell Telephone Laboratories, to support the U.S. war effort. They developed a concept of the spectrogram. This was to take a voice and to break it down into its component frequencies and then to draw lines on a piece of paper to show you where that energy was focused. And without being able to show you one of those, it's a little hard to wave my hands. The point is the spectrogram would tell us if the energy is low frequency or the energy is high frequency. The purpose during World War II was twofold. First of all, to learn to recognize speech by looking at these visual representations of the speech. And secondly, to learn to recognize speakers by looking at visual representations of their speech. The latter application was heavily classified during World War II. In fact, some of the most seminal documents are not available to this day. I've been trying to get for the last year or so Bell Telephone Laboratory to release to me what I believe to be the earliest paper on the use of spectrography in human recognition dating from 1942. Well, the field continued from there. We can jump quickly ahead to the 1960s, and with the advent of digital computers, people quickly got the idea that you didn't have to rely on the human visual system. You could teach a computer to take some statistics from the speech and to make some recognition decisions. You've already heard in this trial about Lawrence Kirsta and his popularization of the term voice print. This upset much of the community. In fact, a very famous acoustician named Richard Bolt spent the next 20 years trying to discredit the voice print, finally ending with the National Academy of Science study in 1979 aimed at saying that the voice print was not a reliable method of speaker recognition. Voice prints pretty well disappeared from our lexicon by 1970, I believe, although they've hung on. There are still some people that are using voice prints today. It's not an accepted technology in our scientific community.
When you say voice print, are you talking about the spectrogram?
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with, let me ask you, I think what I heard you say is the spectrogram method of analysis, or the spectrography method of analysis, has come into disfavor over the last several years at least.
Over the last 40 years at least. The National Academy of Science report to which I refer was written in 1979, so that would have been 34 years ago. But for instance, Richard Bolt, and I keep quoting him because he's so famous in our field, he was one of the founders of Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, now known as BNN. He wrote a paper as early as 1967 arguing against this methodology and the way it had been promoted as infallible in some of the early papers. So I'd say by 1970, I'd say at least for the last 43 years, voice prints have been widely discredited.
Dr. Wayman, have you had occasion to give presentations on the issues, controversies, advancements in forensic speaker recognition?
Yes, in fact, I gave an invited lecture to the IEEE workshop on information and forensic security back in, I believe, December, maybe around December 5th. The workshop was held in Tenerife, Spain, and as you recall, I said I was a distinguished lecturer for the IEEE, so I was asked to come and I gave that lecture on exactly that.
I don't know if you can see this or not, but did that lecture become, was that a PowerPoint presentation with a number of slides talking about some of the things that you and I are talking about right now?
Yes, it was, and that PowerPoint presentation, I believe, is available online. I believe it's freely available online. Let me just caution, the group I was speaking to was a group of practicing professionals that were highly literate in mathematics. That particular presentation contains lots of mathematics that I would not use in any other context other than in front of a group of professionally trained, mathematically astute individuals. I would not try to explain anything that way in a forensic, in a courtroom application. I'd resort to pictures, I think.
Did you make that presentation available, as you say, online and also to us through the PowerPoint slides?
When you say us, I made a copy of that available, I believe, to Mr. Mente.
Yes.
And also to you. I emailed both of you copies of that presentation.
If I were to show you the cover page, would you recognize it, if you can see it well enough?
Yes, that's absolutely the cover page of the talk that I gave in Tenerife last December.
Recognizing what you said, that many of the slides and your presentation is technical mathematic discussion, does this slide summary generally represent, though, the focus of your presentation? The collection of these slides.
Yeah, if you have the whole collection, I can only see the first page, of course. Yes, if that's the collection you have, that is exactly my presentation. I will say this, I sent to you a more intuitive summary of the same concepts maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 days ago that contains the same concepts without resort to the mathematical equation.
Let me see then if I'm speaking of the right one then. I have something in front of me here that has a title page that says Principles of Automated Speaker Recognition. Is that?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And let me explain why I did that. I did that for an audience that could not be assumed to have had a background in digital signal processing or acoustic analysis. The people at this workshop for information and forensic security all had advanced degrees in signal processing or something very close, and they knew the fundamentals of, for instance, I would say to them, Fourier decomposition. This talk that you are referring to does not contain the term Fourier decomposition, nor does it contain any of the mathematics thereof, but rather it contains simple pictures that illustrate the very, very same concepts without the burden of the mathematical notation.
And when you're talking about automated speaker recognition, we're talking about a computer doing the work.
Well, that's true. And on the other hand, there's always room for human involvement. I don't see that we'll ever get to a time where we simply punch the button on the computer and take the computer's word for things. But a computer certainly has proven to be a very, very powerful way to give us some insight as to whether voices are the same or are different, to teach us a little bit something about what's going on with an acoustic signal.
If you'll give me just a moment and stand by, I'd like to mark as an exhibit. Do you have those slides available to you to refer?
Yes, I also have a printout here. My printout, incidentally, is multiple slides per page, so the format is not the same as yours. But I do have the slides here, and they are numbered using the same numbering system on the much larger slides that you are holding.
All right. What's the yours is the same, it's just that it's on multiple slides per page as opposed to mine, which is one slide per page?
That's exactly right. I was
right.
trying to conserve paper.
What I'd like you to do is walk us through this, but let me take a moment and mark it, please.
Judge, at this point, I will interpose an objection on a number of grounds. Number one, it was handed to me somewhere on the order of 4 minutes ago. So I would first interpose that objection that this is a bit new as far as this titled Principles of Automated Speaker Recognition. Number two, this appears to be a writing done by the professor who is about to testify about it. So while I don't object if he wishes to testify to the matters contained in here, I do object to simply dropping, both on the court and the state, something that he prepared a while ago and apparently gave to the defense a while ago because, number one, it's just been provided. More importantly, number two, at this point, it constitutes nothing but hearsay. It would be the equivalent of introducing an article that's been written or something else like that. It's not something that we can effectively be expected to discuss here in court. And so if the witness wants to testify, that's fine with the state, but let's have the testimony as opposed to just dropping something in writing right in the middle of a hearing.
Response?
Yes, thank you. May I clarify something with Dr. Wayman?
Yes.
Dr. Wayman, did I understand you correctly that the presentation, Principles of Automated Speaker Recognition, is a distilled version of your more lengthy presentation called Issues, Controversies, and Advancements in Forensic Speaker Recognition, but without the math?
It's a distillation of the mathematic portion of that paper without the mathematical notation. And am I allowed to make a response at this point to explain my motivation in creating this paper?
We're not talking about your motivation at this time, so please stand by for a minute.
Just stand by for a moment. A couple of things, Judge. This is a distillation of this. I think we've established that. This is a slideshow that's been publicly available for some time and was specifically pointed out to Mr. Manti some time ago and was available. So this really isn't any different than this. And further, it's an aid that will help the witness explain the principles of speaker recognition to the court.
Okay, well,
So,
if it's an aid, why don't we just have it marked as an exhibit for identification, which would be Exhibit D, and allow him to testify to it, and he can use it as a demonstrative aid.
that would be fine. I'd just
Okay.
like everybody to be able to follow along, that's all.
Okay, we'll mark it as Defense Exhibit D, as in dog for identification. And any objections to the court looking at it while the testimony is being provided?
Your Honor, again, my objection isn't so much that the court is looking at it, although I will say in response that there are a number of markedly different slides present in these two things. That, having said that, if the court wants it and feels that it might be useful to you, I don't object to that in concept. My objection is it's just now being provided. It's being provided a week or so after we were supposed to have actually had this hearing. And so the state believes that, you know, that is of a prejudice to our ability to cross-examine it, for example. Having said that, if the court feels that it might be useful.
Let me ask you this question. Did you get the unabridged copy of this slide?
I did. And
So if this is a portion of that, so you did have it?
well, number one, I disagree that it is in fact a portion of it. It's very different.
Do you want to voir dire the witness on that issue?
Certainly.
You may do so.
Do you understand what's going on, Dr. Wayman?
I can hear you very well, Mr. West. I have trouble hearing others in the courtroom that aren't speaking directly to the microphone.
Would the court explain the process?
Yes, I don't, can you hear me?
Barely, yes, ma'am. I can barely hear you.
Okay, what we're going to do right now is Mr. Manti is going to ask you some questions about the PowerPoint that Mr. West wants you to testify to. Did you hear that?
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Manti, you may
yes.
proceed.
Evening, Dr. Wayman.
Mr. Manti, can I ask a question? Should I call up on my computer the presentation I sent you so we can comment on it? I'm a little vague.
Here's what I'm going to ask you for the moment.
Okay.
We'll call the one that you had listed and that we talked about before PowerPoint number 1, okay?
Yes, sir.
Just because
Yes, sir.
it's a long title and I can't say any more than that. We'll call the second one, which I guess has been called a distillation, as PowerPoint number 2,
Yes, sir.
okay? Tell me when PowerPoint number 2 was actually created.
I probably created it on the order 7 to 10 days ago, something like that.
Okay. And how many of what I'll call the slides, the printouts that are contained in PowerPoint number 2, are exact reproductions of slides from PowerPoint number 1?
No, you're absolutely right. The PowerPoint number 1 contained mathematical equations. To avoid the mathematical notation, I explain those equations in pictures here in PowerPoint number 2 because I would not expect the mathematical equations to have any meaning to anyone that hadn't studied math for 10 years.
Understood. So do I understand you'd be saying then that PowerPoint number 2 actually contains nothing that at least graphically or visually is a duplicate of PowerPoint number 1? It's different, but the same.
It's conceptually the same. The concepts are exactly the same, but it explains the fundamentals of the concepts in a way that doesn't require mathematical notation.
Ordinarily,
which a lot of people find off-putting.
okay. Ordinarily, when I hear the term distillation, I'll give you an example. When I was back in school, I used to have something called Cliff's Notes, which were distillations of long novels. They contain sometimes passages of that novel. They contain sometimes verbatim quotes, whatever, but they were just shorter versions. You know what I'm talking about? When I hear distillation in the context that you're talking to me now, it's not like I have 10 slides in PowerPoint number 2, which are duplicates of 10 of the 30 that were in PowerPoint number 1. What I have is a reinterpretation of a lot of PowerPoint number 1, but nothing that I'd call identical quotes or anything like that. Is that a fair description? Am I understanding it right?
No, I would compare it exactly to your Cliff Notes. What these are Cliff Notes. Cliff Notes will tell you, well, Tom Sawyer is going to paint a fence. That gives you the overview of what actually is going on without quoting that passage of the paper. So this, for instance, I can glibly use the term spectral decomposition in front of a group of professionals when explaining automated speaker recognition, and they know what I mean. But with a few pictures here, I can explain the spectral decomposition without using that very confusing term and without using any mathematical notation at all. A lot of people can't follow mathematical notation.
So what in PowerPoint number 2 is identical either in appearance or in quotation to PowerPoint number 1?
As long as you don't use the term in concept, the answer is nothing. But if you use the term in concept, the answer is everything.
But the idea of explaining the concepts is what you're here for today, right?
That's what I thought I was here for.
Thank you. Judge, again, I will, based upon that, restate my objection. This isn't exactly a sort of small version of PowerPoint number 1. It's different.
Okay, so let me understand your objection. You don't object to Dr. Wayman testifying as to what's in the PowerPoint. You just object to the PowerPoint itself being introduced into evidence.
That's correct.
Okay, well, he may testify as to the PowerPoint, and exhibit number D will just be for identification only and not introduced into evidence.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. West, you may proceed with your examination of Dr. Wayman about the PowerPoint if that's where you're choosing to go at this time.
No, I have one, thank you. I'm going to borrow this for a minute. This will be hard. And this one's D. I'm back, Dr. Wayman, thank you. Your longer, more detailed discussion of the speaker recognition presentation is marked as Defendant's Exhibit E that I'm holding up for you. And the one that has, I don't want to use the word dumbed down, but I can't think of another one offhand. The math part of this is marked as D, just to try to keep those straight. If I were to,
I'd prefer not to use the term dumbed down. That's not my intention at all. My intention was to make it more accessible to people that are put off by mathematical notation.
would it require some extensive background in mathematics to understand your presentation as embodied in Exhibit E?
That's exactly right, and that was intentional because the people attending that conference all had advanced degrees in mathematically related subjects. And I didn't have to speak intuitively. I could speak using the notation of mathematics and no one would be put off. In fact, they expected that at the conference. This is not a mathematics conference. I would like to express the same ideas using a more accessible and intuitive way of doing it. It's not intended to be at all dumbed down.
If you were to explain the principles in your presentation as you explained it to the mathematically trained crowd and tried to explain to the court and to counsel the principles involved and the math involved, any idea how long that would take?
Again, with all due respect to everyone in the courtroom, I'm going to assume that you have had fewer than 4 years of college math. And with fewer than 4 years of college math, I'd have to give enough background of the college math. I don't think we could get there from here using those slides. We wouldn't get very far. I think we'd be wasting our time. I would suggest to you we don't waste time doing that. Our time here is too valuable to try to waste it going through those slides.
Well, why don't we then talk about the slides that you prepared for the presentation that you can make today for us that does not require a mathematics training. So should we just look at the second page then?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I give an overview of where we're going and why?
Yes.
I don't want to torment people unnecessarily with mathematical equations. But throughout this hearing, I've heard people refer to concepts like spectrograms. I've heard them talk about Bell frequency Kepstrel coefficients. I heard Mr. Mante even ask if one of the witnesses could testify as to what a Bell frequency Kepstrel coefficient was. We have talked about spectral energy. We've talked about Gaussian mixture models. I think Dr. Nakasone even talked about I vectors. If I was sitting in the courtroom and was not actively involved in this field, these acronyms would mean absolutely nothing to me and would not in any way to my understanding of the field or what we're talking about here. It would all be gobbledygook. And so the purpose of these slides was to try to pull out the fundamental intuitive meanings of these terms: spectrogram, GMM, Gaussian mixture model, Bell frequency Kepstrel coefficient, spectral decomposition. We might even get as far as supervectors and I vectors, although that would be a page after where I stop here. We could go there too without the pages when we're all done.
Let's use your approach in the way that you think we can best understand it. And tell us, I'm sorry, I'm getting a message on the video that we may have problems. Can you still see us and hear us?
I see you perfectly well. I hear you perfectly well. There's a speech compression. We're using Skype, and Skype involves a great deal of speech compression. I have a hard time hearing people that are not speaking directly into the computer. For instance, I have a hard time hearing the judge and hearing Mr. Mante because of the speech compression algorithm employed by Skype, but I have no trouble hearing you at all, Mr. West.
You could take a few days and tell us how Skype works, I take it?
No, actually, one of my patents is in speech compression algorithms, but I don't know that Skype uses the one that I developed. At least I'm not getting any royalties for it.
You would like them to use the one you developed, I guess. Okay, just for a little bit of focus, we'll do the best we can with the signal that we have, and please indicate if you have problems at your end hearing us. It's not so important necessarily that you see us, because we are each referring to the printed material that you have in front of you. So would you just introduce this aspect of speaker recognition and take us to school for a few minutes?
Yes. So we want to get to the point of being able to understand Mel frequency Kepler coefficients as they are applied to Gaussian mixture models, but we have to take this one step at a time. So on page 2, I've shown you 2 smooth waves. These are technically, one wave is red and one wave is blue. The blue wave is higher in amplitude than the red wave. You can see it goes up higher at the top and it goes down lower at the bottom, but it's slower in phase. In the course of page 2, that blue wave only goes through one cycle. It goes up and then it goes down once. The red wave, however, goes up and down twice. This illustrates 2 important properties of every sine wave. They have an amplitude and they have a frequency. We can change the amplitude, we can change the frequency. Now, there's a third part to this wave that we won't be discussing too much. But because there might be someone sitting in the courtroom that's trained in mathematics and signal processing, they'll certainly want me to explain that. And that is where the wave starts. You'll notice on the far left, both the red wave and the blue wave start at 0. They don't have to start at 0. They could start high and come down. They could start low and go up. That's called the phase of the wave. We're not going to be talking too much about the phase of the wave because automated speaker recognition does not use the phase of the wave. It's only interested in its frequency and its amplitude. So here are 2 examples, a low amplitude high frequency wave and a high amplitude low frequency wave, the first being the red, the latter being the blue.
All right. Should we move to the next slide?
Absolutely. So we can add those waves together, and we get this green wave that isn't such a smooth wave. It's kind of a complicated wave, in fact. The point is that we can start with smooth waves, and we can add them together to get waves of any arbitrary complexity, which brings me to the next slide, slide 4.
If you would sort of keep us on track as you go, how the slides work in combination with each other. You've got the... Go ahead.
So on slide 4, I show you on the right-hand side 5 different smooth sine waves. They have different amplitudes, they have different phases, and they have different frequencies. I add all of them up, and you can see on the left side of the page, I'm getting a pretty complicated wave. That wave on the left side looks pretty complex.
What do you mean by adding them up?
So at every value of time, each one of those waves has an amplitude associated with it. At time 0, for instance, back in slide 2 or slide 3, at time 0, both the red wave and the blue wave had a value of 0. And as time increases to 0.5 and to 1 and to 2, the blue wave is going up. The red wave goes up for a while and starts to come down. If we take those numbers at every time and add them together, we get a much more complicated wave. So on slide 4, I'm taking those 5 smooth waves that sit on the right part of the slide, and at every point in time, and time is on the horizontal axis, you might want to call it the x-axis, at every point in time, I'm going to add up those 5 waves and plot the value here on the left, and I get that really funny-looking, complicated wave on the left that is nothing more than the sum of 5 smooth waves that differ in phase, amplitude, and frequency.
All right. Why does that matter to us?
Well, it matters on the next page. On page 5, I'm showing you what we call a time domain representation of speech. I saw the judge held up a paper earlier in the Frye hearing. I believe it was given either by Mr. Reich or by Mr. Owen, and it showed exactly this. It showed a time representation of speech. Someone talks into a microphone, the microphone converts the speech to a voltage, and the voltage is plotted. And here's a picture of speech voltage, and you notice it goes up and down real fast and in a real complicated way.
The title of the slide says speech is a complicated waveform. Its simple, smooth components are changing with time. First of all, what do you mean by speech being complicated as a waveform?
I meant it on the surface differs considerably from those smooth red and blue waves that we showed in slide 2. When you look at speech, it looks nothing like those red and blue waves. You'd say there's no relationship between the red and blue waves you showed me and this real example of speech here in slide 5.
So in other words, the prior slides did not attempt to represent speech.
Not yet. That's the purpose of slides 5 and 6.
Okay. Are we finished with the one that shows speech?
Okay, we can go on to slide 6.
We don't need to. I'm trying to follow along. Tell me what this slide represents specifically insofar of what is pictured here. And is that what you're saying is why you say it's complicated?
Yes. That waveform you're showing there doesn't go up and down in any smooth way that reminds you of the red and the blue waves on the previous slides. It goes up and down in what looks like a seemingly unpredictable pattern.
Okay. And how do we begin to put this together?
All right, so slide 6. Slide 5 showed a speech over seconds of time, but slide 6 shows speech over milliseconds or thousands of seconds of time. And if you look at this, now the speech waveform is starting to look more like that complicated wave that I showed on slide 4.
The
and
slide,
my point is,
the slide you're referring to is when the sine waves are added up to form a single wave?
yes. The question we ask is, what are those smooth waves that when added together form this few millisecond period of speech?
When you say milliseconds, obviously thousandths of a second.
Yes, let's say 30 thousandths of a second of speech, or maybe 60 thousandths of a second of speech. Some number of thousandths of seconds of speech can be broken down into some number of smooth waves, each wave having its own frequency and its own amplitude.
Okay, please continue.
All right. So there are methods for looking at this wave and telling the computer, now I want you to break this wave down into its smooth components. So if I were to add up those components, I could get this wave back. I don't know if it's necessary to give the name for that. That's called a Fourier transform. It's sometimes called a fast Fourier transform. It's the way we do it on a computer. It's not necessary to know that word. It's just a word that may have come up in the past. People talk about asking the computer the question, what are the smooth waves that when added together will give me this complicated waveform? So now we're on slide 7. And this is perhaps the most difficult slide to explain, but what I'm trying to do here is that showing for any small 30 millisecond period of time, I could break the signal down into smooth waves and then plot those smooth waves in the vertical direction, going from low frequencies to high frequencies, and using color to indicate the amplitude of the waves at the various frequencies. So if you look down here on the slide 7 at the left, during the short period of time I'm talking about, the very low frequencies are colored red. That means these low frequencies have high amplitude. But the very high frequencies are colored blue and green, and that means these very high, rapidly moving frequencies have a very little amplitude. And it's those combinations of smooth waves that we have to add up to get this complicated wave that was shown in figure 6 over a period of 30 or 60 milliseconds.
Okay.
Now, we've only in slide 7 been talking about 30 millisecond segments of speech, but clearly every 30 milliseconds we have a different 30 millisecond segment of speech, and we can break those down into the component smooth waves in frequency or amplitude, and we can create this entire color graph right here in slide 8. This is what's called a spectrogram, and this is a color spectrogram. You may have seen black and white spectrograms. This has the advantage that I'm showing you the same information in color. I'm hoping that being in color, it might be easier to understand.
We do have the color here in front of us. And describe what this slide is showing graphically.
Okay. Along the horizontal axis, going from left to right, you might call that the x-axis, we have time. The beginning of the speech segment is on the far left, and it moves to the far right as time continues. In the horizontal direction, we have frequencies, from the low frequencies to the high frequencies. The color telling us the amplitude of each frequency that, when added together with all the frequencies at that particular time, will give us this complicated wave that we observed in the speech. This is a spectrogram, and there's a lot of things we can see here. One of the things we can see is most of the red is at the bottom of the picture. Most of the amplitude, and I'm going to use the term amplitude and energy almost as synonyms. They're not quite synonyms for people that have studied engineering, but in this context, if the energy goes up, the amplitude goes up. If the amplitude goes up, the energy goes up. I'm going to use those terms a little bit as though they're interchangeable. In this drawing, you can see that most of the energy is in the lower frequency. At the very start, there's very little energy at all because there's no speaking. We see all blue in the left-hand part of the picture. On the far right, we see all blue, meaning that the speech has stopped. But in between, we see great areas of most of the red being in the lower frequencies. We can see here, too, some frequencies seem to be more red than others. There seem to be frequencies that are all solid red. In the phonetic world, they call those formants. They indicate the reddishness, the peaks of energy in frequency. Frequency low at the bottom, high at the top, and where we see those red areas would indicate the formant or peak energy of the speech signal. That's slide number 8.
So this is a spectrogram. You've obviously said that. This is a visual representation of speech over time.
Yes. And if we were doing voice prints, this would have been in black and white, and this is as far as the computer gets us. This is a voice print, except as I said, back in the day, voice prints were in black and white. We're trying to illustrate the same information by making denser black instead of red. So the voice print stops here. That's what you get. And now you have to look at that and determine whether two voice prints came from the same speaker. You can see that there's a great deal of subjective judgment that's going to be required to make a decision as to whether this voice print comes from a voice print, the same speaker who made a different voice print, comparing these side by side with your eyes and using subjective judgment.
To be clear, if I understand you, you're saying this is a spectrogram, and this is a sample of speech that if somebody uses spectrographic analysis would be compared.
Number 1, it's a compound. Number 2, it's leading. And number 3, counsel's testifying as opposed to what the witness has said.
Can you break your question down?
I'll do my best.
Thank you.
Judge. I'm trying to put this in the context of our case. You've heard testimony, specifically of Dr. Reich, I think, and maybe to some degree of Mr. Owen about the use of a spectrogram.
Yes, sir. That's exactly where I'm going.
Okay. And maybe you should just go there then rather than me interrupting you. But I want I want the court to know that this is what we're talking about when Dr. Reich talks about spectrographic analysis. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Spectrographic analysis means we look at this picture and try to make a judgment as to who is speaking.
And when you look at it, are you looking at something else at the same time?
Well, you can look at two spectrograms and ask the question, were they both spectrograms of speech of the same speaker? That would be the question you'd ask yourself.
Is that essentially what spectrographic analysis is, comparing two spectrograms to identify their differences or similarities?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay. I'm on track with you. Thank you. Let's continue.
On slide 9, I make some notes about the spectrogram. This is very similar to what you've already heard from Dr. Nakasone. Every spectrogram, even of the same speech from the same speaker, is different. How can spectrograms of the same words from the same speaker be different? There's two things we have to keep in mind, and these were brought forward in Dr. Nakasone's testimony as well. There are speaker characteristics. For instance, I'm noticing myself as I'm starting to talk to you, I'm getting a little bit hoarse. So that's a speaker characteristic. The social context is also important. I'm testifying to you over Skype. I'm using perhaps a different voice. I'm emphasizing words in a slightly different way than if you and I say we're sitting around in your living room drinking coffee. We'd be talking in a different way, and the spectrogram would be different. I'm tired. I'm a little jet-lagged. That plays into this. I may be on some medication. Actually, I'm not. But if I were on any medication, that would impact my spectrogram. My attitude, if I start getting a little surly here, if I get a little frustrated, that will impact my spectrogram. The time of the day, it's late night here in London. I'm starting to get a little sleepy. That will impact my spectrogram. Those are the speaker characteristics, but at the same time, there are channel characteristics that impact the spectrogram.
Before you move to the channel characteristics, insofar as the many speaker characteristics that depend on social context, medication, attitude, fatigue, those kinds of things, are those differences that occur within normal speech, much less yelling or screaming?
Yelling or screaming is one of those speaker attributes, even the volume that I'm speaking. I'm a little bit aware, and it may have to do, I'm not used to using Skype. I'm a little bit aware that I'm speaking in an unnaturally loud voice. And that unnaturally loud voice, I know, is distorting my spectrogram. It's moving the frequencies around in that spectrogram such that if you and I were just to have a casual talk in your living room over coffee, and you were to take those spectrograms and try to compare them to the spectrograms coming out of this speech, they'd probably show very little similarity. They'd be very, very different. The speaker characteristics would be quite different.
You may be speaking louder in order to be heard, whereas you might speak lower depending on the environment in which you're speaking. Is that basically what you're saying?
That's also true. And I want to bring up the concept of stress. I found sitting around, I was at a meeting today, but contemplating this testimony today, I was getting a little bit stressed. And we've got paper after paper after paper in the technical literature that talk about the various forms of stress and how stress also impacts the frequencies of our voice. So I think because I'm under a little bit of stress right now, I'm not used to using Skype, I'm not used to testifying in court, that also is impacting the frequencies coming out of my speech in ways, incidentally, that can't be predicted. We don't know enough about my behavior under different types of stress to be able to correct my spectrogram back to how it would be in a more relaxed, natural state. There's no simple transform that will move my stressed speech back to my natural over coffee speech, if you will. That's entirely speaker idiosyncrasy. I may respond to stress by lowering my voice. I have a feeling I'm speaking in a fairly low voice, but I'm not sure. We cannot say in advance how my spectrogram is going to change. based on the stress that I'm experiencing through what I'm doing right now.
Sure. You were about to, I think, move on to the channel characteristics aspect of this slide.
Yes, and the channel characteristics are very, very important to us right now. As I told you, I was having trouble hearing people that weren't speaking directly into the microphone. That's because Skype, like all, I might say, phone systems, uses speech compression. It's a lossy speech compression. That is to save transmission bandwidth to keep, Skype is free, to keep the costs down. They don't give us a lot of bits and bytes to transfer. They use very clever techniques, of which I have a patent on one of them, as I said. They use very clever techniques to take the amount of speech necessary and crunch it down so that less internet traffic is required, but there's a cost to that. And one of the costs to that is the speech is distorted, specifically the spectrogram is distorted. And the spectrogram distortion depends on the type of compression we're using. And I, honest to goodness, don't know the type of compression that Skype uses. And not only that, it's the kind of microphone. I'm using a little microphone here under my chin. That microphone is probably different than the microphone you're using. So the impact on the spectrogram of my speech is different from the microphone than the impact of your microphone on your speech, because we have two different microphones, and we do not know, without characterizing those microphones, what effect those microphones are having on the speech. And then there's a third thing, and this was the subject really of my PhD dissertation. It's the acoustic pathway between my mouth and the microphone. Now, the microphone's pretty close, but it's below my chin. I'm not speaking directly into the microphone. And that acoustic pathway also impacts the spectrogram and the way that spectrogram looks when I look at that paper. So my point is that every spectrogram is different, even from the same speaker saying the same words. If there's any changes whatsoever in the characteristics of the speaker and the characteristics of the transmission channel, where the speaker includes all the issues of health and social and attitude, and the channel characteristics include the type of phone, the acoustic conditions, the background noise, the compression that's used, the dynamic range of the speech, all of those things. And that's the point of slide 9.
Let's talk a little bit about something more specific to this case, but on this aspect of your testimony. We know that the speech at issue is yelling or screaming of some sort. We'll talk about that more a little bit later, but let's talk instead, though, in more detail about the channel characteristics. If you would assume, for our purposes, that the distance between the source of the yelling and the microphone of the cell phone would be 20, 30, 40 feet. Is that a distance that may have an impact on the spectrogram?
Yes, but it's not only the distance. You haven't given me enough information. I want to know what the acoustic environment was in that distance. Did we have reflective surfaces? Was sound coming through a door or a window or a wall? Were the windows open or closed? Were there curtains involved? Which direction was the microphone of the handset facing? Was it facing towards the speech, away from the speech? Was someone holding that hand phone in such a way that the hand itself was insulating the microphone from the speech? There are so many variables, and again, this was the subject of my PhD thesis, and I was only considering the variables of the reflective surfaces in that intervening distance. Distance is important, but even more important are all the other things that take place in that distance of 30 and 40 feet. So just saying it's 30 or 40 feet doesn't give me enough information. I need much more information than that.
Well, assume as well that the recording was made through a cell phone, through a law enforcement emergency services system. Is there likely to be some compression involved in that manner of recording and transmission?
Oh, there absolutely is compression. Absolutely. And we could talk all day about this, but let me start by saying this. Back from the earliest days of telephony, meaning the 1920s, we discovered that to understand speech, you only needed about the first 4,000 cycles per second. you only needed speech from about 0 cycles per second up to 4,000 cycles per second to understand the content of the speech. You could throw away everything above 4,000 cycles per second. So the first thing that has happened is a kind of compression by throwing away all the high frequencies. And let me just add from a technical point of view one other thing. The phone company puts in what they call guard bands. They give a little space on the bottom and a little space on the top where the frequencies really don't go up to 4,000 cycles per second. They cut them off about 3,700 or maybe even 3,500 cycles per second. So to begin with, before we've even done the type of compression that I worked on and patented, we've compressed the speech by throwing away all of the high frequency content, because at one point in telephony, that was considered as not important to recognizing the content of the speech, not who the speaker is, but recognizing the content of the speech. We can recognize the content of the speech pretty good, even if we throw away all the frequencies above 4,000 cycles per second. So that's the first kind of compression. The second kind of compression is if we were to sample this speech that now contains frequencies up to 4,000 cycles per second, we'd need to make 8,000 samples per second to adequately sample that speech. I have another lecture I can give and explain to you why we need the number 8,000. I won't do that here. If you'll just trust me that we need 8,000 samples per second to adequately characterize speech that goes up to 4,000 cycles per second. Each one of those samples requires some number of bits to encode. So there are very clever ways of cutting down on the number of bits necessary to encode the sample. And those encoding techniques vary from type of phone to type of phone. They can be 8-bit encoding techniques. I heard of a 12.5-bit encoding techniques. They go by names of mu law and A law encoding techniques. What we're trying to do is to get the speech down to a manageable number of bits per second so that we don't overwhelm the telephone transmission system with the transmission of a single phone call. So, to answer your question specifically, that phone has imposed all kinds of compression techniques on the speech, not only cutting off the high frequencies, but taking the sounds that it does get, sampled at 8,000 samples per second, and trying to crunch them down. So not that many bits have to be broadcast over the poor, tired telephone network that's trying to carry other people's phone calls as well as ours.
You mentioned 8,000 samples per second. Is that the same as 8 bits?
No, sir. Each sample requires some number of bits. Let's say, for instance, that each sample required 8 bits. Now, I don't know that that's true on the cell phone that was used in this case. I suspect that something less than 8 bits is being used here on our Skype call. That would be 8,000 samples per second times 8 bits per sample. That would be 64,000 bits of information that would have to be transmitted every second unless we can come up with some clever compression technique. And that's exactly what we do. We have clever compression techniques.
I think where I was confused was that Dr. Reich said that the 16-bit system was critical to his analysis, but then Dr. Doddington said while it might look on its face to be 16 bits, in reality it was actually only 8 bits. Am I talking about something completely different than what you just addressed?
No, you're talking about exactly the same thing. So what I understood from, I read Dr. Reich's report, and what I understood from his report is the 911 call system recorded the call in a 16-bit format. Now, were 16 bits used? That was the first question I had, because it's not common for phone calls to use that high of what we call dynamic range. The fact that a 16-bit format was used doesn't mean that 16 bits were actually sent to the 911 call center, and I would be extremely surprised if 16 bits were used, because that would indicate almost no compression at all. If I recall hearing Dr. Doddington's testimony, he looked at this speech sample, and this is very easy to do. You look at the speech sample and you put together, we'll call it a histogram. You can tell very easily how many bits are actually being used, and I heard Dr. Doddington say only about 8 bits of resolution were being used, even though it was being stored in a 16-bit format. I didn't do that work. I don't know what it was. I would just be shocked to find out that the telephone system used in this case absolutely had 16-bit resolution to it. That's far higher than any system I'm used to using. That's a kind of clarity that I don't know how one would get. We certainly don't have that here when talking over Skype.
Okay. I've lost track of the number of this slide. Is it 9?
We've just finished slide 9. We're ready to move to slide 10.
All right, thank you. Please continue.
All right. So we've gone as far as we can with the spectrogram. Is there any way we can automate this process? Is there any way we can teach computers to do this comparison? And if so, how? That's the direction I want to go into with the next slide, starting with the spectrogram. So in slide 10...
Has the scientific community pretty much given up on spectrographic analysis at this point?
I would say they gave up on it pretty much 40 years ago, but I would say they've completely given up on it at this point, yeah.
Okay. Which direction is which direction is speaker recognition moving, and are you able to talk to that now in the context of automated speaker recognition?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I want to talk about now. The fundamentals, the principles of this automated recognition technique actually go back to the late 1960s, and the slide I'm going to talk about could have been explained to you certainly by 1980. We'll get into some more modern techniques as we go through the slides. But here on slide 10 is what I'm showing you. I got this slide from a friend of mine, Professor John Mason at the University of Swansea, and I found it quite ingenious and as a way to explain what MEL frequency is, and so I hope you can follow along with me. In the upper left-hand corner of this slide, I show again this complicated time domain waveform. Several seconds of speech, the amplitude of the voltage coming out of the microphone is going up and down and up and down and up and down. And then I've transposed that into the spectrogram below. Now, to the right of that is a funny diagram which I resonate with. And I'm going to try to explain what that funny, it's a series of crossed lines is. This explains what the MEL frequency scale is. And I think this is just a real nice explanation, owing really to my friend John Mason. If we look at the spectrogram in the lower left-hand corner of slide 10, you see that most of that red, most of the energy is in the lower frequencies. The red is down towards the x-axis. It's lower value of y, lower value in the horizontal. And that's because speech has most of its energy at low frequencies. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One thing is the ear hears a high frequencies a little bit better. And so since we can hear high frequencies a little bit better, we need less energy up there, but mostly this MEL scale stuff we do because it works. So here's what we do. We take the energy in those high bins and we put it into a very big basket. All the energy from this high frequency bin we stick in a big basket. And slightly below that, we take the energy from a more narrow band of frequencies and stick it into a little narrower basket. As we go down in frequency, we're taking thinner and thinner frequency bands and sticking it into the basket. And then we're looking at how much energy we have in these baskets, from little baskets to big baskets over every short period of time. That's the MEL frequency scale. It allows us to accentuate the energy at the high frequencies because there's not normally much energy up there. It means that when we look at the signal after this, we're going to be advantaging the high frequencies a little bit because they were disadvantaged in the original spectrogram. I hope that makes some sense.
Are you waiting? Is that what it says? You're waiting?
Oh, waiting?
Yes.
W-E-I-G-H-T-I-N-G.
Yes.
Yes. I am weighting those frequencies. That's exactly right. I'm combining more of the higher frequencies together than the bottom frequencies so that the energy appears in the next spectrogram to have more red at the top and less red at the bottom. And that's now a MEL frequency spectrogram. So we're getting to MEL frequency Kepstro characteristics, Kepstro coefficients. We're just not quite there yet.
Would you say that word again, Kepstral? Maybe spell it?
Cepstral is a joke, and I don't remember the person that came up with the joke, but it's a clever one. Cepstral, Cepstral. And the way this was, and I should know the name of the person that came up with this. This person was a very funny person. We started with spectrum, and because we're going to flip the spectrum, he flipped the word and took spectrum and made it Cepstral by flipping the words. There are a series of words like this. Filtering in the Cepstral domain is called liftering, because they took in the L and the F. These are just a series of jokes. We haven't come yet in this discussion to what a Cepstral coefficient is. You're anticipating and jumping ahead to the next slide. All right, so if we're finished with slide 10...
You give me far too much credit.
Okay. So here's what we've done on slide 10. Let me summarize. We've taken this waveform of the speech, and we've determined at every small section of time what frequencies are in the waveform and what their amplitudes are, where the red indicates a big amplitude smooth wave and the green or blue indicates a little amplitude smooth wave. And we find that the high frequency waves have little amplitudes and the low frequency waves have big amplitudes, and that characterizes speech. We've tried to balance that out a little bit by giving more amplitude to the high frequency waves, and that's what we have in the lower right-hand corner, the Mel scale spectrogram.
Okay.
All right, now, I want to move from that color back to numbers. And recall that the red means a big number, a wave that goes up and down a long way. And the green and the blue are little numbers. So if I were to take, at any vertical slice in time, those frequencies and turn them back into numbers, I would get a wave that looks much like the one on slide 11. You see that wave in slide 11 that's doing this thing right here? That's what this spectrum would look like if the colors were transformed back into numbers.
The title of this slide is Changing the Colors Back into Numbers. That's what you're referring to.
Yes.
And that the Mel scale spectrogram is displayed on the previous page is a complicated wave that can be broken down into smooth waves.
You skipped one important thing. Each vertical slice of the spectrogram, the Mel scale spectrogram, each vertical slice, when those colors are turned back to numbers, becomes a kind of complicated looking wave. And I've shown you one here. You see this graph I have that shows kind of a complicated looking wave? That wave itself can be broken down into smooth waves. This is a spectrogram of a spectrogram. I know it's getting confusing, but what I'm trying to do is to show the smooth components that make up this frequency from low frequency to high frequency spread of the speech at every short interval of time. And that's about as simple as I can make it. I can try to say it in other words, but give me one more chance. I see kind of a confused look in your face. Give me one more chance. Please, I'm asking you. When I speak, over every 30 millisecond short period of time, various frequencies are coming simultaneously out of my production track that add up to make this complicated wave. If I look at those frequencies and the amplitude of those individual frequencies, I notice that the low frequencies have big amplitudes and the high frequencies have little amplitudes over every 30 millisecond slice of my speech. If I draw a picture from low amplitude to high amplitude, going from low frequency to high frequency, I get this pattern here in the graph on slide 11. That pattern can, by itself, using the principles developed in slides 2, 3, and 4 of this talk, be represented as itself a series of smooth waves. And those smooth waves, their amplitudes are the Cepstral coefficient. And I'm sorry I can't make it any simpler than that. But that's what a Mel frequency Cepstral coefficient is. It's the representation of this frequency content of my speech during every 30 or 60 millisecond period.
I know that you can explain the math and that you often do that, but for our purposes here, having a better understanding of automated speaker recognition, where does this take us?
So now we have Mel scale Kepstrel coefficient. And that is the first step that we're using in almost every automated speaker recognition system extant today. That's the first step, and we go from there to Gaussian mixture models, which I explain in pictures, starting really on slide 13. Now, slide 13 doesn't have a picture on it. It's going to take me slide 14 to get to the picture.
The picture being a numerical representation of time periods?
Yes, that's on 13, and I graph those on 14.
All right.
Okay. So we're going to have a lot of these Kepstrel coefficients. We're going to have 20 of them or 60 of them. Every automated speaker recognition system uses different numbers of Kepstrel coefficients, and we'll have some other values in there. For illustration purposes, my imaginary system is only going to have 3 Kepstrel coefficients. That is 3 amplitudes of the smooth waves that form the frequencies of my speech at every 30 millisecond slice. So at every 30 millisecond slice, we're going to develop 3 Kepstrel coefficients. Every 30 milliseconds, 3 Kepstrel coefficients. Another 30 milliseconds, 3 Kepstrel coefficients. Another 30 milliseconds, 3 Kepstrel coefficients. And I wrote, just for argument's sake, for illustration's sake, I wrote a bunch of those down here. I wrote down 10 time periods, and I imagined what these 3 Kepstrel coefficients would be for every time period. All right? So now I can take those 3 Kepstrel coefficients, 1, 2, and 3, and I can graph them just as though they were x, y, and z values in a 3-dimensional chart, 3-dimensional graph, and that's what I tried to do in 14. In 14, slide 14.
14 is the slide that has the box?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And inside the box, you'll find those 10 points plotted. So the first point, I have 1.5, 2, 1.1. So in my box, I go 1.5 in the x direction, 2 in the y direction, 1.1 in the z direction. I put a point right there. Now, with my 10 points, you can see my 10 points form 3 different clusters. These points of Kepstrel coefficients aren't just coming out anywhere in the box. This is speech, and the speech is controlled. It's not just random sounds. I'm trying to express something with my voice. I've learned to control my voice over my lifetime, and so the speech isn't just coming out anywhere. These Kepstrel coefficients are clumping. For a while they come out here, and then for a while they come out down here, and then for a while they come out up here, and that's what I'm showing in box 14, that these Kepstrel coefficients that are coming out every 30 milliseconds tend to clump up in the space.
Is that what you mean by the Gaussian mixture model, the clumping?
Exactly right. Exactly right. So the Gaussian mixture model are these clumps that form when I start speaking, and you start plotting my Kepstrel coefficients as I continue my conversation. Now, I want you to notice a couple things about these clumps. There's a center to these clumps. I've got to have enough speech at each clump that I can determine where the center is. But also, each clump has a shape. I have to have enough points in that clump where I can know something about the shape. The shapes aren't necessarily round. It might be that I have a round clump, but the shapes may look more like footballs or ovals. They may stretch out more in one direction than in the other direction. So if I'm going to put together a Gaussian mixture model, I need a lot of speech that I allow to settle into these clumps with enough points in each clump that I can estimate not only where its center is in my box, but I can estimate its shape. Is it long and thin? Is it short and fat? Is it big? Is it little? I have to know something about the space. That means I'm going to need a lot of speaker data to be able to make an estimation on not only the center of that clump, but the shape of the clump. Lots of speech data. to create a Gaussian mixture model, to do automated speaker recognition.
When you say a lot of speech data, can you give us some sense what you mean by that?
3 minutes is a nice period of time, but I'd like more if I could get it. Now, there's a trick I can play, and that's where I'm going to get to when I get to 16, that would allow me to get by with less than, say, 3 or 4 minutes of data. I'm going to construct 100 or maybe 1,000 of these points. So I'm going to need many, of these clusters. I'm going to construct 100 or maybe as many as 1,000 or several thousand of these clusters. I'm going to need multiple points in each cluster. I'm going to need maybe 60 points in each cluster. I'm going to get 1 point maybe only every 30 milliseconds. So I'm going to need lots and lots of speech to create all the points and all the clusters to create a good Gaussian mixture model, unless I take some kind of a shortcut, which I'm about to introduce now.
All right.
Now, on slide 15, I explained why we call these Gaussian mixture models. Yeah, it's an assumption. A Gaussian is a bell curve. I heard Dr. Nakasone spell this, Gaussian. It's a bell curve. The idea is that in these clusters, points are denser at the middle of the cluster, and they get less dense at the outside of the cluster. That is, if we looked at the density of points in a cluster, it would follow a bell curve with the highest density in the middle of the cluster and the lowest density out at the sides of the cluster. I personally, in my own work, have called these cotton balls. By cotton balls, I mean they kind of get fuzzy on the outside. We got a lot of points in the middle, but as we get to the outside, we have fewer and fewer points, and this cluster then eventually fades away. So because we think of the density as being as a bell-shaped curve, we call these Gaussian mixtures.
And how is that a shortcut?
Well, I'm getting to the shortcut. We talk about the shortcut. I introduced the shortcut in slide 16 and then go to slide 17. Now, I make an important point at the top of slide 16. Let's not lose track of the fact that all of this stuff was developed from a spectrogram or a spectral representation of the speech that was speaker and channel dependent. The fact that we've done all of this fancy mathematics and we've drawn these fancy graphs doesn't remove from the problem our speaker and channel dependence. That hasn't gone away. My point being, if you change the channel or change the speaker characteristic, for instance, give me some medication, for example, those clusters are going to move. And they're going to move in ways that we can't estimate. I'm not going to be clustering speech in the same place if the channel changes, or if I start getting a hoarse voice, or if I'm talking to you over coffee as opposed to talking to you over Skype. Those clusters are just going to come out in different places. So there's nothing that we've done so far to remove the channel or the speaker dependency from the creation of those Gaussian mixture models.
All of the concerns that you would have about the speech itself, whether it was under stress, medication, are still present in, I'm saying that very badly, sorry.
No, you're following great. Mr. West, I feel like you're actually understanding me. Maybe you're humoring me, but it feels as though you're getting the point.
You've talked about the mathematics, I guess, the science behind the computer automated speaker recognition, but you're still saying that even if you have a good, reliable system, if you will, it's still dependent on the unique, or on the many characteristics of the voice itself and the other issues, the channel issues, the stress, medication, all of that stuff that you said can affect the spectrogram.
Yes. And so an earlier question you asked me is what would be the effect on the speech if the speech was, say, 30 or 40 or some number of feet from the microphone, if the microphone was placed in this direction, if there were some reflective surfaces involved in the transmission path, if the windows were open or the windows were closed or there were drapes or someone had their hand on the cell phone, all of those things would move these clusters in space in some way that I can't predict. This is getting to be too hard. Those clusters are not going to be in the same place. They're going to move around based on all of those factors which we haven't characterized in this case.
Okay.
So now on slide 16, there isn't a picture. There's just some words to be said. I've pointed out that the clusters are still dependent on speaker and channel conditions, that each speaker may have hundreds or even thousands of these clusters. It depends on who builds the algorithm. You can build the algorithm to say, oh, I don't know, 256 clusters is plenty. But more recently, I understand in some of the SRE tests, is my understanding that they're going up now to thousands of these clusters. Okay, we're going to let this speech cluster into thousands of clusters or hundreds of clusters, but we're going to need massive amounts of data. We're going to have 3 minutes of speech or 10 minutes of speech. More is better, unless we can do a little trick. Now, the trick is going to cost us something. There's no free lunch here, but there's a little trick that we try to limit the amount of data that we need to construct a Gaussian mixture model for a speaker. And that trick is called the universal background model. And that's what I discuss in slide 17. And I have borrowed here from my friends at Lincoln Laboratory a graph they use because I think it's rather clever.
Let's stop for just a moment. Tell me who Lincoln Laboratory is and what their standing is in the scientific community.
Lincoln Laboratory is an auxiliary organization of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. They are an FFRDC. That means a federally funded research and development corporation. They do not accept private work. They accept only work from the government. You read in my resume that I had worked as a staff consultant for RAND. RAND is also an FFRDC. They're a federally funded research and development corporation. So Lincoln Lab is like RAND Corporation, but one of the things Lincoln Lab does and does very, very well is human language technology. And the fellow that introduced Gaussian mixture models to the speaker community in his PhD thesis from Georgia Institute of Technology around 1991 is a very, very good friend of mine. His name is Doug Reynolds, and these graphics came from a paper written by Doug Reynolds, and I liked them so well I thought I'd reproduce them here as opposed to trying to manipulate a graphics routine myself, because I think it can't be put into a picture better than what Dr. Reynolds from Lincoln Laboratory has done right here on slide 17.
All right, let's talk then about slide 17. Are we still on the subject of this shortcut?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is the shortcut. Now, again, there's no free lunch. You're going to have to pay a price here. But suppose you have lots and lots of speech from other people not related at all to what the voices we're trying to recognize.
Excuse me, Dr. Wayman, just a minute. I made a technical error at this end. Judge, I touched the screen by accident. That's why we have those. Does someone know how to clear it?
I don't think it matters.
I'm sorry?
I don't think it matters.
Is it easy?
It might still be just fine.
Do you have any problem seeing us?
No, I'm seeing everything beautifully. I'm hearing you, I'm seeing you, I have no trouble.
Rather than taking risks, then, let's continue then, because we can still see you fine too. Okay. Again, we're on slide, I think, 17. You're talking about the shortcut.
Right, and that's the uniform background model. I'm sorry, the universal background model. Well, we debate whether the word universal should be used or not, but here's the point. Suppose I have a lot of speech from people unrelated to the problem at hand. I'm trying to solve a problem. Did this speech segment come from the same speaker as this speech segment? That's the problem I'm trying to solve. Suppose I have lots and lots of speech from people that aren't involved in this thing at all, but the speech was collected under very similar channel conditions and very similar speaker conditions. So I'm trying to recognize people speaking over a cell phone using English. I have a lot of cell phone calls of people speaking using English. I've got hours of this stuff. I create these Gaussian mixture models for all of these people in the background. Now, I'm assuming that they have the same speaker and channel conditions, as the speaker and channel conditions of the test I'm about to perform. But because I don't have a lot of data from the speakers I'm interested in identifying, I go out and get a whole bunch of unrelated speakers, and I use their speech to create these models where I know the shape and I know the centroid real nicely. Okay. Now, I've got a reduced size data set. I don't have 30 minutes of speech or even 3 minutes of speech. Maybe I only have 20 seconds or 15 seconds of speech, something like that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let my points collect around those balls, those Gaussian balls, those cotton balls of my universal background model, and then allow my cotton balls of the background model to move over a little bit to accommodate the points that came in from my speech sample. So instead of coming up with these thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of points required to get the center and the shape of each one of these balls, I'm going to take the center and the shape of the balls from different people not related to this case and move them where I need to move them to accommodate the speech that I have from the speaker of interest in this case. That's called the universal background model, and these two pictures demonstrate that. It shows these gray ovals being moved so that they swallow up these few training points. And you'll note the two ovals at the bottom didn't move because there were no training data down there to cause them to move, but the two ovals at the top pushed up to accommodate the training data from the little amount of speech that we had for the speaker of interest.
And how does that help in what later becomes, well, let me just have you speak then. The next slide talks about we now having a Gaussian mixture model.
But I want to make sure I'm very clear that unless that universal background model was collected under similar conditions of both the speaker and the channel, we've wreaked more havoc than we've solved. There's no free lunch here. We didn't get something for nothing if the channel conditions and the speaker conditions aren't compatible with the sample that we're trying to learn from. So no free lunch.
I'm sorry,
Okay.
I missed that completely. Could you give us an example then of what a problem would be without similar samples?
Sure. Suppose that you've already heard talk of the Linguistics Data Consortium and the speech that they collect for the speaker recognition evaluation of NIST. They collect speech from college students speaking over phones. I think nowadays most college students have cell phones, so probably most of the speech they're collecting these days are from cell phones. Suppose we use that as our universal background model, but the speech in question is whispered speech. Or maybe it's whispered speech not even in English, where most of the conversations collected at Linguistics Data Consortium were in English. Suppose that the whispered speech is not over a telephone handset, but is a very high-quality studio microphone. Oh, now we've created more havoc that we've resolved, because now we're trying to warp these clusters that were collected under different conditions by data that is completely unrelated to the clusters that we have from the universal background model. That's the problem. There's no free lunch. So your universal background model better be a good representation of the conditions of the speech that you want to recognize. All right, so now we're on slide 18. Okay, so now we have Gaussian mixture models of every speaker we know with the centers and the shapes for each cluster in each model. A model is for a speaker. There's a Jim Wayman model, and remember, Jim Wayman's model has maybe 300 clusters or maybe 3,000 clusters, depending on whose system we're using, right? Now, suppose there's an unknown speaker under similar conditions, speaker and channel conditions. So now you want to test a hypothesis, knowing Jim Wayman's model, you want to test a hypothesis that this unknown speech came from Jim Wayman. And you built the model under the same channel and speaker conditions as the speech in the unknown sample that you want to test. Now you turn on this system, do exactly what we talked about before. You have this time domain waveform, you convert it into this spectrograph, you do the Mel scale thing where you give a little, push the energy up to advantage the higher frequencies a little bit more. You cut that up into segments. You get a funny-looking wave that you break down into smooth waves. Those smooth waves are Kepler coefficients. You start plotting them in the box, and you see if those points start falling near the center of the clusters that represent Jim Wayman. You see? So you've got Jim Wayman's clusters. You say, now we know where Jim Wayman is, and here come some points. Could they have come from his cluster? Well, I don't know. How close do they have to be to his clusters before you say, yeah, that's him? And how many of these Mel scale Kepler coefficient points in the box are you going to need before you're willing to make a decision? Yeah, you know, that could very well have come from Jim Wayman. And anyway, what if the channel or speaker conditions are so different that it is me, but the points are not falling near my clusters because things have changed? This is a hard problem. The problem doesn't get easier just because we've abstracted it and put it into a computer. We've still got these fundamental issues we've got to deal with.
What you're talking about now, trying to identify your voice, for example, does that require your speech and the, I think you called it the universal speaker model, under similar circumstances with similar channels?
Exactly right. So we've got three things that have to be similar or we're in trouble. The training data that by which you make my model, the universal background model has to have some similarity because you took a shortcut of not getting 3 minutes or 3 hours of my speech. You trained on something less than that. And those conditions have to match the conditions of the unknown sample, or else it's not going to look like it's me at all. It's going to fall and look like somebody else, or not look like anything, or it's going to be a big mess. Now that brings us to the very last slide, and I know some people are going, oh, thank goodness, we're done with all of this. We're down on slide 19, and I just wanted to make a couple of final closing points about all of this, that the entire approach is fragile. And I think that word was used by Dr. Nakasone in his testimony, but it's a word we use in the community. We say this is a fragile technique. To recognize, I've written 4 bullet points down here on this last slide 19. I want to read them. To recognize a speaker from an unknown sample, the speaker and the channel conditions of the unknown sample must match that of the training data. That's the data that made the Jim Wayman model in the first place. The speaker and channel conditions of the universal background model must match that of the training data and the unknown sample. There must be enough training data to estimate both the center and the shape of each cluster, and there must be enough test data to make a good decision. Now, I'm hoping that that introduction, the relationship between that introduction and the facts of this case, is absolutely crystal clear and transparent, so that you don't think I've been wasting the last 30 minutes of the court's very valuable time in telling you something that's completely irrelevant to this case. I think these points are completely relevant to the other testimony that's already been given in this case. And I think we've done, to recap, I think we've defined Mel frequency Kepler coefficient. I think we've defined Gaussian mixture models. I think we've defined spectral decomposition. That's the process of taking this very complicated wave and breaking it down into smooth waves. That's called spectral decomposition. And I think also we've defined universal background model, and we've talked about some of the challenges facing automated speaker recognition, particularly when working under unusual conditions and with small amounts of data.
In this case, as you know, Mr. Owen used an automated speaker recognition software program that he called Easy Voice Biometrics. And have you listened to the recording with the screams, the cries for help, to know what the sample was that he was working with?
Yes, sir. I have heard that recording of both the redacted and unredacted version.
Can you explain to us how what you've just gone through in detail without all of the math, how that applies to the software at issue? And I don't mean that you know what that software is even, but how does the speech sample under the circumstances that you've talked about fit into whether or not the methodology that Mr. Owen used could be reliably applied to the facts of our case?
I did read a report from Mr. Owen in which he said he used Gaussian mixture models with support vector machines. I stopped at page 19. I did not make additional pages for you. I don't want to take the court's time to go the one or two more steps we need to go to get support vector machines, because we've gone far enough. We've got enough of this. Support vector machines is just one more level of abstraction that is fairly easy to explain, but I don't want to have to explain that. So he's claiming, by using the term Gaussian mixture model, and the fact that Gaussian mixture models are almost always based on Kepster coefficient, he's claiming that his automated method uses precisely what I described in these previous 19 slides. He doesn't give us any details. He only uses the word Gaussian mixture model. But the way Gaussian mixture models are commonly done these days, they're based on Mel frequency Kepster coefficients, and they use universal background models, and they would follow, although I don't know the specific details of his software, I have no idea. It should, on its surface, using the term Gaussian mixture model, follow exactly the methodology I explained, and should be subject to the same fragility of methodology that I explained. He is going to have the same problems that I explained, meaning matching channel and speaker conditions in his training with his unknown data with his universal background model.
How difficult, in your opinion, would it be to do a reliable speaker identification analysis through automated speaker recognition with the voice samples we have of the screams in this case?
All right. When I listen to those screams, I am not willing to jump to the conclusion that all the screams are being made by a single speaker. I have to look, if I were to do this, and I would never attempt to do this because, as I made available into another a report I made available to you that came from the U.S. Secret Service, we have to know, Secret Service calls it when to punt. We have to know when to refuse a case. I would never take this on. But if I were to take it on, I would never assume that all of the screaming came from a single speaker. I would have to figure out each segment of scream and which speaker to assign it to, meaning that at most I'm going to have less than a second's worth of data. A second's worth of data, let's say if these are 30 or 60 milliseconds of time period, I'm going to have less than 30 of these points in my space for every segment. And from 30 points, I'm going to have to make an estimation as to whether there's which speaker, whether I know the speaker or not. 30 points is far too few points to put into my box and determine whether they came from the clusters that are already there, even if the model was well-trained and on the same channel and speaker conditions. So going through this data and hearing the screams, we've got much less at each segment than a second's worth of data. We have far fewer than 30 of the points in the box. That's simply not enough data by anybody's estimation to do any reliable guesstimate of who the speaker was, even if we can narrow the speaker down to two potential speakers. That's what makes this case kind of interesting, is we're willing to stipulate, I think, that there were at most two speakers. I don't think anyone would suggest that there could have been more than two speakers, but a scientist never knows. I wasn't there. I have no idea who else might have been out there shouting, but I'll stipulate with you there was only two speakers, but it's still not possible to solve this puzzle from 30 points put into a box to determine which of the two speakers it was, on top of the fact that these are fragile methods.
Are you aware, given the advances in automated speaker recognition over the last several decades, of any software program that is accepted in the scientific community in which you belong and in which Reva Schwartz belongs and Joe Campbell and Peter French, that would produce reliable results in analyzing a voice sample like the one we have in this case with screaming?
No, I do not. And not only that, if someone were to develop such a model, I think that person should be eligible for the highest award in our community. I don't know what that award is, but that would be such an important breakthrough. There is no Nobel Prize for speaker recognition, but that would be a breakthrough worthy of something like the Nobel Prize. That would be absolutely earth-shattering if someone were to come up with something. That would be completely new, that would be completely novel, that would be a stroke of genius, and my hat off to that person that was able to develop such an algorithm. I have never seen such a thing.
Do you make it your business to know what's going on in the speaker recognition scientific community?
Yes, one of the things we didn't talk about is the fact that I'm a founding member of the scientific working group on forensic and speaker recognition. And in that working group, I chair 2 committees. There are 5 committees in the working group. One of the committees is the Vocabulary Development Committee. I chair that because of my background in vocabulary development. But I also currently chair the Committee on Science and Support of the Law. I intend to hand over chairmanship of that committee to someone more qualified than I am, perhaps a federal judge, a retired federal judge, someone like that, someone with an international reputation, as soon as we really get the Speaker Recognition Committee up and rolling. So I make it my business to know what's going on in this committee. I'm particularly interested in the application of speaker recognition to forensics. I'm particularly interested in the intersection of speaker recognition and the law. I find science and the law to be rather strange bedfellows. That's part of the disconnect that maybe you feel with me. You speak a different language than I speak. You're trying to speak to me without having to dumb things down for a non-lawyer. I'm trying to speak to you and try to simply make the mathematics more intuitive. We're trying to cross the divide with each other. So to answer your question directly, yes, I make this my business to understand advances in the speaker recognition community and how those advances might apply to the legal community as well.
You mentioned the name Riva Schwartz. And do you know Ms. Schwartz to be a member of the forensic speaker identification community?
She is also, the answer is yes, and she is also a founding member of the Scientific Working Group for Forensic and Investigative Speaker Recognition. Hiro Nakasone is the chairman of the overall working group, and Riva is a founding member, one of about 10 founding members.
What is the objective of this working group, and where does this working group stand in terms of its ability to achieve those objectives?
So the working group has had, technically speaking, 2 meetings. The first meeting was just a fairly short formal meeting for the purpose of establishing the bylaws. The first big meeting was a 3-day meeting. We've only had one. That was back in March. We're trying to kick this group off in an environment that, of course, we're facing this government budget cuts, the sequester. We hope to have our next meeting in November, and it's the goal of this group to develop standards for speaker comparison, standards for best practices of data collection. Let me narrow in on that a little bit. Suppose that you had a person for whom you wanted to develop a speech model. We have a person of interest, and we want to make a speech model to see if that person could have been the voice on an unknown call. Under what conditions would you collect his or her speech? Would you have them read something? Would you ask them to tell a story? What kind of a microphone would you use? What kind of an acoustic environment? Would you have them sit outside? Would you have them sit inside? Would it be a reflective acoustic environment? What kind of a microphone would you use? How would you interact with the speaker? All of these things lack any guidance or standards right now in our community. So the Scientific Working Group, SWIG Speaker, is going to create standards for the data collection, standards for reporting in court, standards for examination, hopefully standards for the accreditation of speech recognition examiners. We've got a lot of work to do, a lot of work to do. We're just getting started, and we've only had one big 3-day meeting. This will take me the rest of my working career to move this forward, and I intend to stick it out.
Dr. Wayman, do you either attend presentations by others in the scientific speaker recognition community or make yourself familiar with the positions of people like Riva Schwartz or Joe Campbell?
Yes. I not only attend meetings, I read journals, and I read books, all related to forensic speaker recognition.
Are you familiar with Riva Schwartz's presentation that you identified when to punt?
Yes, I am familiar with that, and I have a copy here in front of me, in fact. This is a paper she gave in November 2011. I heard this paper given. It was at the Acoustic Society of America meeting in San Diego. It was a meeting of the Forensic Acoustic Subcommittee that has recently been formed by the Acoustic Society of America. And I heard her give that talk, and I passed along to both you and Mr. Mante a copy of her slides. I believe there are, I'm seeing 16, no, a few more. I believe there's a total of 17 slides in her talk.
Do the slides summarize some of the issues that we've been talking about today?
Yes. More specifically, her talk, and it was given by both Reba and Joe Campbell, also Wade Shen of MIT Lincoln Labs, was focused on the idea of when should we not take on a case? When is the unknown speech exemplar so inadequate that we should refuse to render an opinion at all? We should, she used the word punt. We should simply say, no, I can't take this case. What you have given me is inadequate for analysis. In this paper, Schwartz, Campbell, and Shen try to come up with some guidelines on when to punt.
Let me just clarify then. Campbell and Shen are with the Lincoln Laboratories of MIT?
That's correct, and they're regular participants in the speaker recognition evaluation. Campbell is also a founding member of the SWIG speaker group.
You said there were 10 founding members?
Approximately 10, 11.
Does that include now yourself, Dr. Nakasone, and Joseph Campbell?
Yes, and Reba Schwartz is among them. I could try to list the rest. The problem with that is I'm going to forget somebody and get into trouble.
Talking, though, about this talk, are you familiar that Reba Schwartz is a forensic examiner with the United States Secret Service?
Yes, I believe that Reba also holds the title of National Expert in Speaker Recognition.
Do you know what that is or what that means?
I don't. She and I had a series of very, very extensive email conversations in the course of creating the concept for SWIG Speaker, this scientific working group, and she mentioned that to me in one of the emails she sent me, but I don't know precisely what she means when she says she's recognized as the national expert. I don't know.
When the phrase "when to punt" on speaker comparison, is that in the context of when not to attempt an analysis, or when to reject a sample for speaker comparison because you know that it's not of sufficient quality?
That's my understanding of their meaning of the term "when to punt," exactly.
And are some of the criteria for that decision, at least insofar as the Secret Service is considered, part of this PowerPoint outline?
Yes, but I would also add that if you look at the top, it has all the markings of MIT Lincoln Laboratory. So this was not only done and reviewed by the U.S. Secret Service, was done and reviewed by MIT Lincoln Laboratory. In other words, this can be said to be the opinions of both the Secret Service and MIT Lincoln Lab.
In this presentation, is it referenced that that when speakers are under stress?
One, it's hearsay. He's reading from someone else's, not even paper, PowerPoint. Number two, it still hasn't been provided to me.
Okay.
But
on the objection for hearsay, I need to sustain that objection. It's not Dr. Wayman's PowerPoint, and it's really not appropriate for him to comment on somebody else's PowerPoint.
May I be heard briefly on that matter?
Yes.
Your Honor, I think that under Frye and Ramirez, as Frye has explained in Florida, invites the court to consider not just the testimony of individual experts as they may appear at an evidentiary hearing, but also to search beyond that, including information that's available through research articles, through, in effect, hearsay, professional hearsay. What is the state of this art at this time?
But you're asking Dr. Wayman to comment on somebody else's research. And, you know, if you want me to look at certain research, you can file it. But respectfully, I don't think that Dr. Wayman can comment on somebody else's PowerPoint. So I'm going to sustain the objection.
Your Honor, I've marked a copy for the court, and it is Exhibit F for
Okay.
identification.
Has a copy been provided to the state?
No.
Well, Dr. Wayman indicated that he believed that this presentation was provided or was identified to the state. Perhaps you can clarify that, Dr. Wayman.
It was my impression that I sent Mr. Mante a copy of this. Now, all kinds of things can happen. I'd trust Mr. Mante's judgment on that. Did he not get a copy? I thought I was sending a copy to him.
For the record, no copy's been received. What the professor sent me was a copy of his earlier presentation, the one he referenced at Tenerife that we've discussed already. Nothing by anybody else.
Well, I'm happy to provide that.
You know, at this point in time, I don't know that he can effectively cross-examine Dr. Wayman on somebody else's PowerPoint that he has never seen before, and you've marked it as an exhibit for identification, and it'll remain as an exhibit for identification purposes.
I'm happy to provide a copy now, just so there's no mistake as to that.
Okay, you may do so. The objection is sustained as to his testimony about somebody else's PowerPoint.
Certainly, thank you. Dr. Wayman, are you, though, familiar with Reva Schwartz and Joe Campbell and others in the relevant scientific community as experts in the area of speaker identification?
Yes, I am. I would say that they are a very strong part of the relevant scientific community.
Likewise, are you familiar with Dr. Hirotaka Nakasone?
Yes, Hiro, as I said, is the chairman of the Scientific Working Group for Forensic and Investigatory Speaker Recognition, of which I'm one of the founding members and the chair of 2 of the subcommittees. I know Hiro quite well.
As well, do you know or do you know of Dr. George Doddington?
Yes, I've gotten to know George Doddington a number of conferences. You asked me, one of your previous questions to me was whether I attended conferences in this area. Yes, I attend conferences. George Doddington attends those same conferences. I would say that I know George pretty well. I've known him for maybe almost 20 years.
Excuse me 1 minute. Let me look for another. Oh, here it is. Let me approach the clerk, Your Honor.
Just a second.
Should we take a few-minute recess?
Do you need a break? You sure?
We've been at it for 2.5 hours.
I'm just concerned about the court reporter and her. Okay. She said if we take a break right before cross, she'll be okay.
May I approach the clerk?
Yes, you may.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Wayman, you had mentioned an organization, the IEEE.
Correct.
And are you familiar with its publications?
Judge, I'm going to object again at this point before we get any further down this road, because anticipatorily, what I've been handed appears to be a magazine article from Signal Processing Magazine, not authored by this witness. I will make the same objections I just made. Number one, it's hearsay. I can't cross-examine its authors because they're not here, and it would be inappropriate for this witness to testify about the contents of this. If he is familiar with literature or authoritative research, I understand that, and he's permitted to account for that in his opinion. Citing chapter and verse and introducing exhibits of things written by other people who aren't here does violate the rules of evidence. That is my objection.
Your Honor, responding, if I might, I'm going to ask Dr. Wayman if he is familiar with this particular publication and this particular article in the publication by IEEE Signal Processing Magazine. It's an article dated March of 2009. It's authored in part by some of the individuals that he has already identified as experts in the speaker identification scientific community. I believe that the hearsay objection is unavailing because part of the court's mission in a Frye hearing is assembling information from all areas that it may consider, giving it whatever weight it chooses in determining whether the expert's testimony in this case satisfies the Frye test.
You can ask him if he's familiar with that publication in the article, but he cannot testify as to what somebody else wrote because, as Counsel Mr. Manti has said, he has no opportunity to cross-examine the author of that article as to the basis for it. So I'm going to sustain the objection.
That's absolutely right. I won't ask Dr. Wayman whether he agrees or not, although maybe I spoke too soon. I think that he should be able to comment if these are other recognized experts, if we're trying to identify what the relevant scientific community thinks about this issue. So I would offer that, and I would mark it as it's been marked and ask Dr. Wayman if he can identify the article to start with.
My additional objection, not to mention the fact that I just got this, is that that would constitute the very definition of improper bolstering by non-testifying witnesses. What I gather is that Mr. West intends to ask this witness if these other people whom the witness has identified as being experts agree with him. And that is the definition of improper bolstering by hearsay. So the state does object on that ground as well.
That's not my purpose, Judge. I can state that more clearly.
I'm listening. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to ask this witness, Dr. Wayman, if the authors of this article, which is titled Forensic Speaker Recognition, A Need for Caution, are recognized experts in the scientific community of speaker recognition. And I'm going to offer then the article for the court's review, in that the court is undertaking its own investigation, if you will, to determine whether the evidence of speaker identification should be admitted in this case. And this is an article written by recognized experts on the very subject matter of which we are here today.
Your Honor, my response to that is simply that 90.706 provides that such items might be admissible for cross-examination use. They are not admissible in the context in which the defense, Mr. West, is attempting to offer them now. There's a reason it's set forth as only for admissible for cross-examination purposes, authoritative literature in the field. And it doesn't say anything about being admissible for direct examination because that's improper bolstering.
Okay, and if you look at 90.706 of the Evidence Code, it does say that statements of facts or opinions on a subject of science, art, or specialized knowledge contained in a published treatise, periodical, book, dissertation, pamphlet, or other writing may be used in cross-examination of an expert witness if the expert witness recognizes the author of the treatise, etc. So it's a cross-examination use, not direct examination. So the objection...
May I speak to that briefly? Because I think we have a different situation here. I don't disagree that that would be the procedure to follow in trial with an expert.
I think the rules of evidence really do pertain to any matters before the court in a proceeding, whether it be Frye or otherwise, doesn't it?
Your Honor, I urge the court to review the Ramirez decision.
I'm very well familiar with the Ramirez decision. Doesn't say that the rules of evidence are abated.
No, Your Honor, what it does suggest, I think, is that the court should undertake and consider everything related to this issue, including studies and articles and treatises.
I understand that, but my ruling is going to stand. If you'll move on with the next issue, I think that for the record you have identified that as defense exhibit G for identification. And if you'll go ahead and ask Dr. Wayman your next question.
All right, may I have just a moment?
Yes, you may.
Thank you. We'll be right with you. Stand by. I'm sorry to inconvenience the court, but
I'm not inconvenienced.
if we could take a short recess now, I can figure out what I'm looking for and go find it.
Okay.
Thank you.
The court will be in recess for, let's say, Dr. Wayman, can you hear me?
Not very well. If Mr. West could repeat for me, I could hear it much better.
Okay, we could do that. We're going to be in recess for, how long do you need?
15 minutes?
For 15 minutes, if you'll let Dr. Wayman know that he can stretch and move about if he wants to, and we'll be in recess for 15 minutes.
15 minutes, Dr. Wayman. We'll be back with you. Would you stand by?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Court is in recess. Session. Yes, we're ready. If you want to get Dr. Wayman back.
Dr. Wayman, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, okay, good.
I can hear you.
Great.
Dr. Wayman, hi. This is Don West again. You can hear me?
Yes, sir, I can.
All right. I'd like to continue then a little bit. We spent some time talking about the science behind automated speaker recognition systems. You've also had the opportunity to consider the methodology that Mr. Owen used in preparing the speech samples for analysis by his software. Is that correct?
I read what he wrote. I didn't understand it very well. There wasn't enough detail for me to really make a critical comment. It lacked detail, I would say.
Let me ask you then a couple of specific questions. were you, do you understand or did you know that when the computer software rejected the voice sample that was subject to analyze because of the length, that Mr. Owen looped the sample to increase the length so that the machine would analyze it?
I heard him say that, but that was confusing on a number of counts. First of all, we agreed that no one has said all of the screaming comes from the same person. So he had these less than 1 second snippets, each of which he had to ask, who spoke this? So the idea of smashing them all together and then looping them twice on its face makes no sense at all. Unless he was absolutely certain that all the speech came from a single speaker, which no one is hypothesizing, it can't be hypothesized. We weren't there. We must test every segment to say, does this segment come from a particular speaker?
Well, let's assume, just for our discussion here today, that all of the screaming sounds came from one person, but the machine rejected the voice sample because of its length. Would it be an acceptable methodology in the scientific community to make it seem like there was more speech just by repeating the same speech over again?
Of course not. If you'd like me to give you a concrete illustration, I'd be happy to do that.
Sure.
I use a 4-digit PIN for my ATM card at the bank, right? So I'm going to give you 4 digits of my PIN, and it may go out on the internet right now. It may go out to everybody. I'm going to give you 4 digits from my PIN. The first digit is 1. The first digit is 1. The first digit is 1. And the first digit is 1. Does that give you enough information to use my ATM card? Of course not. That information is completely dependent. I've already told you that the first digit was 1. Telling you 4 times doesn't give you any more information. If I have this much sound, I can loop it 50 times. I still only have this much sound.
In your opinion, is Mr. Owen's methodology from that perspective fundamentally flawed?
It's fundamentally flawed on both counts. That the methodology would only work if you could prove externally that there was only one speaker. In other words, we say we are going to take it on God's word that there was only one speaker there, and now we've got this much from one speaker. Okay. Looping it is not going to make more speech from that one speaker. If the fundamental assumption is flawed, all the bets are off.
Are you aware in the relevant scientific community any computer speaker recognition software that could accomplish what Mr. Owen says his did?
None.
If his methodology and its application through his software could do what he claims it did, would that be new and novel in your scientific community, and to what extent would that be significant?
It would be breathtakingly new and novel. As I mentioned before, there's no Nobel Prize, but I certainly would nominate the creator of that software for our highest prize in this science. That would be an outstandingly new and significant achievement. That's fabulous.
Thank you, Dr. Wayman. I do want to touch base, though, just a little bit before I finish here. Have you had the opportunity to review the report of Dr. Alan Reich?
Yes, there were at least 2 different versions of that report that I read, and I read each one of those versions several times.
Are you familiar with the methodology that Dr. Reich claims to have used in his analysis?
No, I can't say that I am. I mean, again, the methodology was a bit confusing. He claimed 16-bit dynamic range would allow him to simply crank up the volume. I don't know why he thinks there was 16-bit dynamic range. And when you crank up the volume on something that contains fundamentally no content, it's like a Rorschach test. You start reading in to any of this what your neural pathways are doing, not which occurred in the external stimuli you're trying to pay attention to. In other words, there's not enough stimuli there to do anything but reflect what's going on in your mind. No, I don't know this methodology. I didn't understand the methodology. I was baffled.
If his methodology, whatever that actually is, were able to do what he says he did, that is to not just identify speakers from this sample, but to identify speech that no one else can hear, would that be new and novel, and to what extent in your scientific community?
I'm going to object. Number one, it calls for nothing but speculation. The witness has already said he doesn't know anything about the methodology. Asking him, therefore, to speculate about what might happen if he did know about it is an improper question, even for an expert. He's asking him to testify about something that might happen about something he's testified he doesn't know about.
Your Honor, if this is a methodology that Dr. Reich employed that is new or novel or unknown to an expert in the area, it would therefore be new and novel and would have to be established in the, as accepted within the relevant scientific community. Clearly, Dr. Wayman is one of those experts, as is Dr. Nakasone and Dr. Doddington and Dr. French.
Dr. Wayman has not testified as to Dr. Wright's methodology as being new and novel. He did as to Mr. Owen, so I will allow him to explore that area.
Are you able to go ahead and answer my question?
Could I ask just a clarification? The current pending question, I believe, is asked to Dr. Wright.
Right, he has not given the court an opinion as to whether he thinks whatever methodology he believes was used by Dr. Reich, whether it's new and novel or generally accepted in the scientific community.
I understand. So my question is, as to the court's ruling, my objection was that since he doesn't know, any comment he would be about to make would be nothing but speculation. But so
I think he can answer the question. Overruled.
Yes, sir. Dr. Wayman, I'm not sure how much of that you were able to hear from where you are.
I didn't hear any of it.
The court agreed that you can answer my question. I asked you about, go ahead.
No, please restate your question.
I know you said you weren't exactly clear Dr. Reich's methodology. But, let me back up a little bit. What are the generally accepted methodologies for speaker identification in the scientific community?
Well, we've talked about at least two. There's an oral phonetic structured listening approach that's used by people such as Reva Schwartz. There are computerized approaches, most of which at the current time involve Gaussian mixture models and extensions thereof. And there is the old style voice prints that have been discarded by our community.
Did Dr. Reich use any of those methodologies?
He used some kind of an oral methodology, but the point I'm trying to make is that he did not include adequate explanation in the report I read for me to understand in detail what it was that he actually did. The report, from my point of view, contained insufficient detail for me to comment about his methodology. There wasn't enough detail there.
Do you have an understanding of each of the methodologies that you've identified?
I am not particularly strong on the oral listening structured approach. You'd have to ask Reva Schwartz more about that, or Peter French. We talked maybe about Paul Folks. There are people that understand that. They're forensic linguists. I am not a forensic linguist. I'm a I'm a mathematician and a computer programmer by background.
Are you aware of any methodology accepted in the scientific community that would have made produced reliable results in speaker identification that were used at least in part by Dr. Reich?
No, I don't know, and I don't know what Dr. Reich did even in part. What I read was of insufficient detail for me to understand what he's got going on there. I just don't understand it.
Mm-hmm. Do the principles that you've talked about in terms of the quality of the speech, the effects of the environment, the stress, the medication, the length of the speech, whether it's yelling or normal speech, including channel issues, distance from the microphone, the kind of cell phone technology, the bit rate, and all of that stuff, still enter into whatever methodology it was that Dr. Reich used?
Oh, of course. There's no methodology that can magically make those problems go away. A methodology, if it were to exist, would have to find a way of dealing with those problems. Mm-hmm. A lot of this just appears to be like magic to me. I don't understand enough about what's going on. Or the report was of insufficient detail for me to make a scientific analysis. I'm kind of at a loss to answer your question because the two reports I read, simply lacked any level of mathematical detail for me to figure out what was going on.
Are you aware of any methodology that would result in reliable results of the sample in this case, including whatever it was that Dr. Reich did?
Judge, asked and answered, and the last part calls for nothing but speculation.
Okay, I have to sustain it at this time.
Are you aware of research that would enable speaker identification so as to identify age by the pitch of the voice?
I think there has been some work done on that, but again, pitch of the voice is so impacted by these speaker variables, how loud one is talking, the style of one's speech, that it certainly would not be dependable. But I can imagine that, yes, you could say that younger children generally speak in a higher pitched voice than older adults. There is a correlation between pitch and age. I'm sure we could find plenty of research to indicate that.
Mm-hmm. In this case, Dr. Reich commented about pitch of the voice being related to how far along he thinks Trayvon Martin may have been on the developmental scale, and he extrapolated and found...
Object. Number one is compound, number two is leading.
Okay, do you want to break your question up?
I'm sorry, I'm really tired.
I understand.
Okay. Let me ask you another question or two about Dr. Reich, and then we'll finish up at least with my part. Dr. Reich mentioned in his report that he was able to identify speech in the two calls that he considered that no other expert has been able to identify. He indicated that he used amplification as one of the tools. Are you aware of whether or not that's an accepted methodology for trying to identify very faint speech?
I think it could be. I see no reason why one couldn't turn the volume up to help you hear something better if the fundamental content's there. Am I allowed to comment on the question you were posing earlier about the statement in Professor Reich's paper regarding an estimation of the age of the speaker based on the formant positions? Am I allowed to comment on that?
Yes, I'll ask you that question, and and go ahead and give your answer.
All right. There's research available, published research, that shows that formant estimation, and that's the principal frequencies, that's the real red horizontal areas that we looked at in the spectrogram, those are very fragile. Those are sensitive to all kinds of conditions, and in fact, they're quite sensitive to the particular telephone type that was used. There's one study that shows that use of a landline increases the first formant by about 5%, but use of a cell phone increases that first formant by 29%. And these are just the cell phones and the landlines that were tested in this particular case. My point with regard to Dr. Reich's work is that he was talking about a displacement of that first formant upward by 17% from laboratory measurements using laboratory microphones. Well, of course it was displaced upward. The fact that there was a cell phone involved in the phone call would displace it upward. But all of the other effects, the speaker effects, the channel effects, could also displace that formant, meaning that that statement that he could say something about the development of the person making that cry on the basis of the formant location lacked adequate explication of these other variables. Did he not know that the phone itself can impact the location of the formant? Did he not know that the channel and the speaker characteristics can impact the location of the formant? Why didn't he deal with this in his report? I don't know what to make of this.
Let me touch upon one other subject for a minute, and then I'll be finished. What is this notion of examiner bias, and how do you believe it may have played a part in Dr. Reich using extremely amplified sounds?
Judge, if I could, I'm going to object on that. Number one, the very question says how it may have played a part, which is calling for speculation. Number two, it's outside the scope of the Frye hearing. That was the subject of the written objection filed earlier.
We've had lots of testimony on this. It's squarely a part of the Frye hearing, because in the Frye hearing, the state must establish that Dr. Reich used an accepted methodology to form the basis for his opinions. And I'm asking a qualified expert whether there is an accepted methodology and what the risk is of error, if nothing else.
What we're talking about is whether or not sounds are audible on the tape. That is not a matter that's subject to the Frye hearing. That's subject to a McCoy analysis by the court. What's subject to a Frye hearing is whether or not a technique for speaker identification, which of course is the only thing challenged in the motion filed for a Frye hearing, is new, novel, scientific, and subject to this. So we're talking about two very different issues, one of which has nothing to do with the Frye hearing at all, and that's the whole reason that that notice got filed in the first place.
Your Honor, Mr. Manta has made that argument before without success.
Okay.
We're talking.
Let me just interrupt you. I believe it was Dr. Doddington who was on the stand last Saturday who, I believe it was him who talked about examiner bias in this same issue, and I will overrule your objection.
Dr. Wayman, we're back here, and you may respond to my question regarding examiner bias in the context of Dr. Reich's analysis.
All right. As you know, I'm quite interested in the definition of words, and bias is one of those words, unfortunately, that's used in a couple of different ways, one way in the common parlance and the other way in science, and they're not quite the same way. If we speak casually about a person being biased, we think that there's something wrong with that maybe they're not being fair, that maybe if someone is biased against me, they're trying to do the wrong thing against me. In this particular context, biased is not used in that sense. Biased is used to mean that I must bring my subjective judgments to a case using everything I know about the world. I have no choice but to base any decision I make in life on what I have learned through the extended course of my life. And that includes all of these examiner biases. So the way that it's used in the literature is to say that if an examiner goes into a case and knows something about the circumstances of the case beyond simply what he or she is asked to do, namely look at 2 exemplars to determine if they were the same speaker, that person brings in other types of subjective judgments that should have been left out, but the person can't help themselves but to include. You're subject to bias, I'm subject to bias, we're all subject to bias because we have this neural processing system that wants to base our decisions on everything we've previously learned in life. And if we previously learned something about this case, there is no way we can make an objective judgment. There is going to be something about this case which comes in. And in this particular case, one of the biases is we're biased towards speaking English. Dr. Reich seems to think that these 2 people are speaking English. That may be true. That may be a reasonable bias. I'm not saying it's wrong. But he came in with the bias that they were speaking English. I don't think anybody told him that, but he knew from the circumstances of the case that there's a high likelihood they were speaking English. He was looking for the formation of words that would be common in his speech. From my point of view, both Mr. Zimmerman and Mr. Martin are young people, and I don't know how young people talk to each other. I don't know how they would argue. I don't know how they would shout. But he brought in his, as he had to, his ideas as to what they might say. One of the words he thought was help, and he thought another word was stop, because he was biased to look for these words. It doesn't mean he's wrong, but it just means that he brought in subjective opinions that he applied to the material to come to some conclusions that were as much about what presuppositions he took into the analysis as the data he was analyzing itself. I hope that makes some sense. It's getting very late here too as well.
Yes, thank you. In this particular analysis that Dr. Reich did, he has offered an opinion that there were words spoken by Mr. Martin and by Mr. Zimmerman, again, that no other expert has been able to identify. Is there a risk of examiner bias when an examiner is looking for, as you say, English words out of short fragments of suspected speech under extreme amplification?
I've got to be a little bit careful because we're getting a little bit outside of my range of expertise. My common sense tells me, as it tells you, that absolutely that would have to be correct. There are experts on examiner bias. I am not one of them, but this is bringing up some real red flags with me to say that he's digging deep here to try to recover some signal where there's no signal at all, and what he's really reading is his own neurological responses and what's in his mind to begin with.
Dr. Nakasone talked about avoiding examiner bias by using blind listening panels.
Yes.
Is that an acceptable methodology to reduce examiner bias in a situation like this?
Part of the problem is, and this was brought out in the National Academy's report 2009, Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, A Path Forward. We don't have these standards about how to avoid examiner bias. So when you said as an accepted method of avoiding examiner bias, accepted by who? It would be one method of avoiding examiner bias, but since there's no sense of acceptability, forensic science in the United States lacks a lot of these standards. This is one of the reasons why this report from the National Academies of Science, that is the Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, has struck such a resonant chord among so many scientists, is that we intuitively know that progress needs to be made in this area. So is it acceptable? Well, we don't have that concept of acceptability yet.
Is that one of the goals and objectives of the, I think you called it SWIG, the SWG?
Absolutely. You're absolutely correct. That would be one of the goals.
Dr. Wayman, thank you so much. That's all the questions I have. Mr. Manti may have a few for you. Just stand by.
Thank you, Mr. Webb.
Dr. Wayman, you need to take a little break. I know it's kind of late over there.
No, we just had a 15-minute break. I'm good.
All right. Do I understand you to essentially say that at this time, both in the areas of forensic speaker recognition, as well as even in the international community, there aren't, as you put it, definitive standards yet developed.
I can't speak for the international community because I know there are a number of forensic speech organizations here in Europe. I'm just saying in the United States at the current moment, we do not have adequate standards for forensic forensic speaker recognition, and developing such standards is one of the goals of this scientific working group that we've been discussing.
So, and did I understand you to say, too, that the United States actually opted out of an international effort in that regard?
No, I didn't say that.
What did you say?
I said the United States national body opted out of a standardized vocabulary development effort. This was to develop a standardized vocabulary for talking about automated human recognition systems.
And in vocabulary, you said that that was one of your specialties. Before I get there, this is the first time that you've been offered as an expert in a U.S. court, am I right?
In a criminal trial, that's correct.
Okay. Have you testified in civil trials?
No. Well, I've been deposed in a patent. I've done some patent work, but it hasn't ended up in court like this, no.
Okay. Back to the issue of vocabulary. Did I understand that the whole purpose of vocabulary, as you explained it, or studying vocabulary, or coming up with standards for vocabulary, is because even among communities, as you said, people talk past each other. They use the words differently.
Correct.
Okay. Would that include such things as methodology and community? Those types of words get used differently.
I think the word community is rather vague, so I don't think it says anything specific. We don't say which community and who belongs to the community. I understand the word, and I think you understand the word, so the problem is not the word itself, it's the word is very vague in general.
And when we talk about, as you said, the speaker recognition, or Mr. West kept using the term scientific community, there are a number of those. I think you referenced even there's 3 different journals at a minimum that use the term biometrics, right?
Right.
Okay, so biometrics, you mentioned the Acoustic Society, you mentioned NIST, you mentioned the FBI. All of these, to some degree, represent different vocabularies.
Yes, right, that's true.
The fact that the vocabularies are different is what one of your goals in creating standards is. You want to create a set of words or rules or things, the universal language type thing. Do I get that right?
What? I think that's a bit grandiose. I don't want to create a universal language. I would just like to create a few terms where we can agree on the meaning so that we don't have to talk past each other.
As it stands right now, you believe that that's a lot of what goes on, is talking past each other.
I think that's true.
Okay. And that would be even amongst persons who do the same work that you do, such as you mentioned the biometric fields or the speaker recognition fields.
Well, let's not exaggerate that. We certainly can communicate some ideas, and we can communicate a lot of ideas. I think we don't always communicate as precisely as we should, and I don't think we communicate outside of our community in clear language. That would be true.
Do I understand that, the whole purpose of forming working groups and committees is because there is not this sort of universal agreement, even among folks in scientific communities, plural?
I think there's more universal agreement than you think, but it has not been canonized. We haven't written it down enough. We haven't reached a consensus on precise words. I think there's a lot of agreement on when to punt, for instance, in this community. I think there's a lot of agreement that there needs to be a cautious approach to forensic speaker recognition. We're all in agreement, but we haven't articulated that in any single paper yet that has been stamp of imprimatur, you say, of the community as a whole. But there are some papers that we like that we say, yes, we're pretty much in agreement on this.
as far as papers, you referenced that. The reason for submitting papers for peer review or writing things down, reports and such, is so that other folks can evaluate them, right?
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct.
And you said, did I understand that you said you actually evaluated a written report by Tom Owen in this case?
I evaluated a report that claimed to be of his methodology, but again,
was that and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but was that a report written by him, or are you reading a report that someone else wrote?
I believe it was a report written by Mr. Owen. It was presented to me as that.
Presented to you as that by whom?
I believe I received this from Mr. West, and it was said to have been written by Mr. Owen, and it explained the methodology that he uses when applying this speaker recognition software he has.
Do you have that report in front of you, and can you just tell me what the date is on it?
It's not dated. That was one of the problems.
Okay.
It wasn't dated and it wasn't signed. And let me see if I can. I don't have it up right this instant on my computer. It wasn't dated. It wasn't signed. It was named as Owen, and it tried to explain some of the techniques used when evaluating speaker recognition.
Okay.
Using this STC software.
Okay. Do I understand that you are not yourself familiar with and have never actually used that particular software?
That's correct. That is correct.
Now, you understand it, I guess. My impression from what you've testified to is that you are aware, at least general terms, of what speaker recognition software, including something like that, normally would do.
Correct.
But the specifics of it, you've never used it, this case or any other.
That's correct.
Okay. So the problem from your perspective isn't necessarily that the software is bad or wrong, you just aren't familiar with it.
No.
Okay.
That would be an incorrect characterization. I would say that software of this type has never been applied to these mixed conditions, a condition where training data is of one set of speaker and channel characteristics, and the unknown exemplar is a completely different set of channel and speaker characteristics. That's a test that the NIST SRE, speaker recognition evaluation, has never taken on, to my knowledge. No one's ever tried to do that with any software, because it just extends past what we can do.
So, and you told Mr. West that you had, I think you said you'd heard the recordings in question in this case. When you say you'd heard the recordings, you heard a recording of the defendant in this case talking with a phone operator, and you also heard the 911 phone call. Am I right? Those are the recordings you're talking about?
That's correct.
Okay. You never heard a recording of a voice exemplar of Trayvon Martin?
I did not.
Okay. And I think you told me that you spent, I think, less than 10 minutes even actually listening to those recordings on just basically your desktop computer.
That's correct, because I know when to punt.
Okay. And in fact, you told me that you wouldn't, once you heard them once, you weren't interested in conducting any analysis from that point forward. Your impression was those were not going to be analyzable, period.
No analysis on those recordings could reach a reliable result, in my opinion, based on what I know about automated techniques or even spectrographic techniques.
And do you recall when you arrived at that conclusion?
The first time I heard the tapes.
Which would have been when?
I became aware of this entire case back when the country became aware of it. What was that, in June or July?
June or July?
Last year. I'm making that up. It was sometime around a year ago, I think.
Well, did I understand you to tell me earlier that you had given a presentation, I guess, in December about it, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And back when we last spoke during your deposition, I asked you about, you hadn't commented anything other than that lecture in December or discussed it in any other form? Is that
No, I
right?
didn't say that. No, I did not say that.
You didn't say that?
No, no, sir.
Okay. You said, do you remember me asking you what you'd seen? You said the only report I had read prior to being contacted by Mr. West or Mr. O'Mara was the FBI's report. I hadn't seen or heard anything about a Helene report, an Owen report, or a Reich report.
When I said the only report I had read, I was meant out of those four reports, the only one I'd read. I'd read news reports. I'd read reports in the common media about the case. I had not read the Owen report, the Reich report, or the Helene report prior to talking to Mr. West or O'Mara, although I had read things in the past by Mr. Owen, not about this case, but things that he had written on his website. I'd read those in the past.
Okay, and in fact, you have a relationship, I guess, I think you put it as a friendly collegial relationship and share several committees with Dr. Nakasone, right?
Oh, yes.
Were you involved in the last time that Dr. Nakasone testified in the same case as Mr. Owen?
No, I was not.
Were you aware of it?
No.
Have you and he ever discussed it?
We have not discussed any particular case. We are both aware of Tom Owen.
Okay. Now, you don't recall me asking you the question about you haven't commented other than the lecture you told me you gave. You haven't discussed this in any other form, and your answer being, well, no?
I may have misunderstood your question.
Okay.
I thought we were talking about discussing the particulars in this case. That somehow I had had some special knowledge through talking to Mr. West or Mr. O'Mara. I have not discussed anything based on any special knowledge obtained from Mr. West and Mr. O'Mara, including the reports of Helene, Reich, and Owen. I haven't discussed that with anybody.
So when is the first time you made what I'll call a non-private comment about the case, about the specific samples here?
So I receive calls on almost a weekly basis from the press to comment on all kinds of things involving automated human recognition technologies. I received, I think, an email, not a phone call, from somebody in the media, and perhaps it was an online newsletter, I'm not sure what it was, way back, maybe in June or July, or maybe close to a year ago, I don't really remember, to ask me to make a comment on the case. And I said nothing could be said about who was speaking on those calls, because by then I had heard them, and by then I had decided we really need to punt, meaning that there's not enough detail in these phone calls for us to determine who is screaming in the background. And I did indeed tell a reporter that there's nothing that can be said about the source, the human source of the screaming in the background. And I think I also told him I'd be willing to testify to that regard.
And you told him that after just hearing those, at that point, how many times did you even heard those calls?
I'd heard them a few times because, first of all, they were all over the media.
Sure.
And secondly, I think by then I'd even downloaded them. I'd heard them several times.
Do I understand that you have not, let me rephrase that. Have you ever submitted your own algorithms to NIST or anything for testing? I think you said you hadn't, right?
That's correct. When I was developing speaker recognition algorithms, the NIST speaker recognition evaluation did not exist.
Okay. And you yourself don't, what I'll call perform or forensically evaluate forensic speech samples. You don't do that sort of thing, do you?
You are correct.
Okay.
You are correct. I do not.
So, unlike some of the other folks we've heard from in this case, I think on both sides, that is not work you do.
That's correct.
Okay. And by evaluating a forensic sample, I mean sit down, actually apply processes to it, and arrive at conclusions if you can.
That's correct. You're correct in your statement.
Have you ever done that sort of work?
No, I have not. I've not forensic work. That's not what we were doing.
Okay. As far as Mr. Owen's software in particular, Mr. West asked you a series of questions about the looping. Having not used it, or I think you told us you don't know details about the software, are you aware of, assuming that the software would reject a sample as being not long enough, are you aware of the code or the reasons that would be with this particular software?
Sure. The manufacturers of the software made a when to punt decision, and they said, look, don't be giving us 4 seconds or 8 seconds or whatever of speech. There's nothing we can do with that, because remember my little dots that were falling into the box? If you give us just 30 dots, we're not in a position to make any choice, any decision at all. However, don't give us the 30 dots 15 different times and claim you now have 4,500 dots. You can't keep giving me the same information over and over again and think you're telling me something new.
If did you make any effort at all to understand or interpret the content of the background or the screaming itself that is evident on the 911 tape?
What I heard led me to believe that I was not qualified to make any statements about content therein, because I just plain couldn't hear any of it at any volume.
So the answer is you made no effort.
I think you're being a little harsh.
Okay.
I made enough effort to determine that no amount of effort could result in a reliable decision.
Now, Mr. West asked you about the agreement with the FBI, for example, in certain parameters in their report in this case. I think about Dr. Nakasone in particular. You have in the past testified as it relates to conclusions reached by the FBI, have you not? Or have written about conclusions reached by the FBI?
Right. Yes, and you're referring to the Daubert challenge in the case of Byron C. Mitchell. Absolutely, I wrote about that. And I worked as a technical advisor to Robert Epstein, who was the public defender who brought the Daubert challenge to fingerprinting in about 1998 or 1999 up in Philadelphia, where he was trying to get fingerprint evidence excluded under Daubert rules.
May I object? Dr. Wayman, I'm posing an objection if you would just stand by. Your Honor, this has nothing to do with speaker identification, voice recognition. This whole line of testimony relates to fingerprinting, and it's not relevant to what we're doing here.
What is the relevance?
The relevance is that he has been asked to essentially agree with or vouch for other reputable persons, and the relevance of this is those same sources aren't always as reliable as Mr. West has asked him to say that they are. In other words, he can and has disagreed with them in the past.
Okay, I will give you some leeway.
Thank you. Dr. Wayman, I apologize for the interruption. Please go ahead and finish your answer.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to restate the question, because I don't know where we are.
Sure. We talked a little earlier, and you talked with Mr. West about reports from agencies such as the FBI in particular, and you were discussing with us that the FBI is certainly, at least in your opinion or given your past behavior, not what you would consider an infallible source of scientific information, at least based on your writings that you were just in the middle of telling us about.
Correct. There was a recent court decision, and recent meaning the last 5 years, up in Baltimore in a federal court. It was a in limine hearing. The judge was Susan Souter, and that case was Rose versus the state of Maryland, and it was about the admissibility of fingerprint evidence. And Judge Souter used the term not to be believed without basis, those types of terms, at least 5 times in her finding. The FBI has been hung out to dry a couple times for being indiscreet, not careful about what they've said in fingerprinting. But they were not the same people that are involved in this case. That was a completely different group.
I understand, but you actually, I think the phrase you used was you accused them of fabricating evidence, essentially. It's fabrication of scientific evidence in that Daubert case that you were referencing, right?
That's right. I was very, very upset. The report was written both by the FBI and by their contractors, and I was absolutely appalled that they would put forward as scientific something that was just beyond the pale. It was just silly talk.
You have also, speaking in terms of just the general commentary you gave about biometrics itself, you've also opined about, and you referenced the National Academy of Sciences reports, you've opined about something along that line before, specifically as it relates to calculation of DNA population statistics, right?
I think I have. I'm trying to think back. I've been heavily influenced in my career by a professor of statistics at University of California, Berkeley, named Peter Bickel, who served on the first DNA committee of the National Academies of Science in 1994. There was a second committee on the National Academies of Science in 1996. They reached startlingly different conclusions about the reliability of DNA evidence. And Professor Bickel wrote a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science claiming that the DNA 2 committee, the 1996 NSA committee, went way too far in estimation of the error rates for randomly chosen DNA samples. Did you lose your lighting there?
Yes, my fault.
We have located the source of that. I believe it's being fixed. So I asked that question to ask you this. The National Academy of Science, that is the body, you referenced earlier scientific working groups and things of that nature. Describe for us the National Academy of Science vis-a-vis the opinions of how it speaks for the scientific community, as it were. Tell us what that is.
I mentioned my work on the National Academy of Science panel on information technology that does the biannual overview of NIST. I did not mention the work, or maybe I did, it's so late now I can't remember. 2 previous committees I served on in the National Academies of Science. One was called Authentication Technologies and Their Implication for Privacy, and the second committee was called Biometrics. I think it had the title Wither Biometrics. The Wither Biometric Committee, which issued the report Biometric Recognition, Opportunities and Challenges, met at about the same time that the National Academies of Science Committee on Forensic Science met. So I was part of that process. Now, you want me to describe the process? I can.
Not so much the process. What I wanted to do was the National Academy of Sciences is, I'll call it a sort of collection of scientific working groups, for lack of a more articulate way to put it. Would that be fair?
Okay, sure. I think that's
okay.
Right.
And you just described 2, as you put it, radically different reports that same academy authored and published 2 years apart, right?
The DNA 1 and DNA 2,
Okay.
radically different in their conclusions. Their conclusions were different. The DNA 2 were willing to push the possibility of a random collision of DNA samples to, I don't know what it was, possibility of 1 in a billion, whereas the DNA 1, as I recall, was only willing to say 1 in 1,000 is the chance of a random a selection of 2 DNA patterns that would match.
And DNA 2 is what I'll call are you familiar with the phrase, the product rule?
Oh dear. Yes, unfortunately, and you're well acquainted with the case of People versus Collins. So I don't think we want to go there, do we, really?
Well, Dr. Wayman, the reason I asked the question is, are you aware that the product rule has actually been held to meet the Frye standard in the state of Florida, which is where we are?
Are you aware of Lawrence Tribe's rebuttal to the case of People versus Collins called Trial by Mathematics?
You're talking about Professor Tribe from Harvard?
Yes. And,
yes.
And listen, the People versus Collins, it was a California case, and that was all over the legal literature for 40 years. you're not going to drag me into making any statements about the product rule being acceptable anyplace.
Would it be
if it's acceptable in Florida, I would like to come down there and talk to Florida.
Oh. Would it be fair to say, then, that even among such august bodies as those on the National Academy of Sciences, there can be, and appear to be, maybe still is, disagreement about even such fundamental things?
No.
No?
I don't know anybody in the National Academy of Science who's willing to stand up and defend a naive application of the product rule. Really? Really? I don't think so.
Are you offering, I guess the opinion in this case that you're offering is that no opinion can or should be offered, am I right?
Correct.
Okay. Not that this is or is not one voice or another, simply that the samples are not sufficient for analysis in your opinion.
Correct. Now
Okay.
is the time to punt. Correct.
You mentioned, and I guess we talked about at some length earlier, this PowerPoint number 2.
Yes.
Remember that? And you said you sent that to Mr. West 7 or 10 days ago. The reason for creating it was what?
I had been listening to some of the testimony in this case, and I thought we were using terms like, in fact, you used the term Mel frequency Kepler coefficient, and you asked, I think it was Mr. Owen, if he could explain that, and you said, you pointed to his microscope and asked him if he could explain that. We were using terms like Mel frequency Kepler coefficients and Gaussian mixture models, and I felt that we were using them in a way that was glib and didn't get to the heart of what we were talking about. I was trying, it was kind of a Micah's moment in my mind where I thought maybe I could bring some clarification to the court by trying to get behind these terms and explaining that there's no magic here, that there's just science, and that science can be fragile, and I thought I was doing the right thing by bringing this up. Now, maybe I did the wrong thing. Time will tell, and I'm sorry to have taken so much time of yours tonight, and your time is valuable. But I thought I was doing the right thing.
All I wondered was when you were going to send that to me, like you did to them.
I'm sorry, I don't know the rules here.
Okay.
And as you pointed out, this is the first time I've testified in a criminal trial, and I didn't know the rules. I thought I was doing the right thing. I'm trying to be a friend of the court. I'm trying really hard here to try to explain these concepts in ways that maybe people can understand, and maybe I've been off base tonight. But I'm trying to do the right thing here and to be a friend of the court.
We were talking, and I think you talked briefly about listener bias. And that is bringing your preconceptions of a sample to your actual analysis, right?
Yes.
And some people have preconceptions that there are certain facts in the case, and I think you said that it is possible that a listener, simply because they have that, can't remove it from their head, and either consciously or unconsciously it might affect their analysis.
We're all that way. Yes,
Okay.
We're all that way.
Would that include even folks like yourself who have said, or who say, my conception is that this is essentially useless forensic sample for any real purpose, and therefore you bring that, since you said bias isn't really a right or wrong connotation, in the not right or wrong connotation, you bring that bias to bear.
Okay, yes, but let's not personalize this too much. Remember, I work in a scientific community, and I sense what the scientific community says. I read papers like this, Forensic Science Need Precaution. I read the National Academy of Science report on strengthening forensic science in the United States. I read the editorial in Science Magazine by Donald Kennedy, Is Forensic Science an Oxymoron? I am well aware of these things, and I bring all of that, as well as my personal biases, into my statements. And so I think that it's more than just me going off and saying, this stuff, we don't have enough data here. I think in some sense I'm reflecting the opinion of the community on this.
Well, we're back to that vague word, community, again, right?
Correct, correct. Okay. And I might add, the word community appears right there in Frye, And it also appears in Daubert, which I know you're not a Daubert state, but my point is the law does use the term community. The law does use the term community. And I'm not just using this term arbitrarily, and I'm saying the law doesn't, I don't think, define it any better than what you and I have defined it here.
Thank you, Dr. Wayman. No other questions, Charlie?
Thank you. Any redirect?
Briefly.
Briefly is the key word.
Thank you. Does the product rule have anything to do with what we're talking about here?
Not directly. We could probably find some relationship, but it's not coming to me right now. It does not have a direct bearing on anything we've talked about tonight. But
okay.
It may in the future.
All right. And your comments about the FBI in the context of fingerprints, did that have to do with the way the FBI conducted a fingerprint analysis in a specific case?
Yes, I want to be a little bit more specific about that. They did a mathematical model that I found to be seriously flawed. I found it to be more than seriously flawed. I couldn't believe that this could even be a serious work of science, and they presented that at the Daubert challenge to fingerprinting in the case of Byron C. Mitchell as science and as evidence of meeting that Daubert criteria for a known or potential rate of error. And this was just a crazy report. I couldn't believe that they did that.
That report was case specific, is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. It was called the 50-50 study. And others have written about it since then, I might add. I'm not the only voice within the scientific community that has objected to the 50-50 fingerprint study offered by the FBI and their contractors in the Daubert challenge to fingerprinting in the Byron C. Mitchell case.
Does that analysis by you regarding the FBI report, statistical report, have anything to do with this case?
Completely unrelated. I prefer at this time of night in particular to talk about surfing or something. That's got about as much relationship to this case as the Daubert challenge. Florida is not yet a Daubert state, as I understand it. This was a completely, the only thing similar are the words FBI. The FBI occur in both stories.
Okay. Bear with me. You made the comment, Dr. Wayman, I can find that the NIST SRE has not tried this because it extends past what we can do. Can you explain what you meant by that?
I have to be a little bit careful because I do not know all of the conditions under which that NIST has run the SRE. However, it's my understanding that NIST SRE has never tested shouting at a distance against training exemplars captured on a cell phone, such as that 911 call that Mr. Zimmerman made that we have been calling, I think, call 1. I know nothing in the NIST SRE that emulates those conditions.
What did you mean when you said because that would extend past what we can do?
In our international standard on biometric testing, I wrote a good portion of that standard. It's called ISO 19795 Part 1. We talk about the 3 bears rule. We actually got the word 3 bears rule from NIST itself, an earlier publication by Dr. Jonathan Phillips. The 3 bears rule is as follows. You want your test not to be too hard because everybody does terrible and gets 0. You want your test not to be too easy because if everybody gets 100%, you can't differentiate between systems. You want your test to be just right so that some people do well, some people do poorly. And if we were to have a NIST SRE test against data collected in the manner of this case, I think that's just too hard. I don't think anybody could do well. I think you'd end up with everybody having very, very poor performance, and you'd learn nothing, in effect, from the test.
You mentioned having reviewed some, you called it a report, but then you clarified that it had to do with the software, I guess, the Easy Voice system. Said it was an undated report, that it was provided to you by me. Do you remember saying that?
It was provided to you by the team. It was an undated report. It was more than a description of the software system. In fact, I would say it did not describe the software system at all. It described some type of likelihood methodology that was both confused and confusing. It was hard for me to follow that. More specifically, after mentioning in this report MFCC Gaussian mixture models, the report proceeded to show a graph of nothing more than some mean frequency average, a little bit like you took that spectrogram and rammed it together from the sides, which is certainly not Gaussian mixture modeling. That was a troubling and disturbing report. It was my understanding, because of the title on the top of the file, that it somehow was connected with Mr. Owen, but I may have misinterpreted that.
There's a document connected with this case that's called Comparison Parameters and Speaker Similarity Coincidence Criteria.
That, I believe, is the report. Now, I'd have to call it up and look at it. If you can show me a page of it, I could identify it as the one that I'm referring to.
I can show you the first page, if you can see it.
That looks about right. Can you show me about the third page where it shows a graph of a spectrum? It's like a cross-section of that spectrogram I showed.
I'm showing you the fourth page. See if this is it.
Okay. That actually is a spectrogram. I think there was another graph following the words GMM is what I'm referring to. The words GMM appear in the report, and it's followed by a kind of what amounts to a mean spectral average.
Here's a page that says Gaussian mixture models based method GMM.
There you go. And that is not a Gaussian mixture model. That's a mean spectral average of some type. Yes, this is the report I was referring to, and I was told that somehow is connected with Mr. Owen.
Do you find this to be a flawed discussion of the science involved that you explained in more detail earlier?
It's very flawed and troubling, and the use of the words is not anything within the way we use them in our community, and the description of GMM just is not correct, and I had great trouble with that report.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd like to mark this, if we might.
For identification?
Sure.
If you want, if you wish.
I think I would offer it, actually, but I can make the predicate, I think. We don't have to do that now.
Counsel said he was not aware of it. You want to show it to counsel?
Counsel provided it.
It depends on what it is, because I still haven't seen
Well,
it.
if you'll please
It was
look at
provided in
it.
discovery from Mr. Owen.
Sorry, I thought this was referenced or reputed to be a report about this case by Mr. Owen.
I think that Dr. Wayman said that he had read some papers by Mr. Owen, and that's the one he was referring to. Had you not seen that before?
No, as long as we're clarifying what I haven't seen and what I don't think anybody has seen.
No, have you seen this?
This paper, yes, and no
Okay.
objection to it.
Okay, then this paper instead will come in as defense exhibit number 5.
But I'd like the record cleared up that it's not a report, and it's not about this case.
It's not a report, it's a paper.
Well, to be clear, I'll ask.
It's not a report on this case. That's what he's saying, so we
Agreed.
can agree to that. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
It's come in as exhibit 5.
To the extent that what we've been talking about is a report and a discussion about the Easy Voice software and how it works, which includes a discussion of the Gaussian method, is it your opinion that it's fundamentally flawed?
It's my opinion that it's fundamentally flawed. I didn't find any details in there about the software. I took that report, maybe I'm wrong, but I took that report because you sent it to me as indicative of the methodology that Mr. Owen uses when he does speaker recognition. And I assumed, maybe wrong, that it was that methodology that he intended to apply to this case. Now, if you're telling me that that report has absolutely nothing to do with this case, then I stand corrected. I assumed that I was sent it because that was the methodology Mr. Owen was planning to use that to inform his testimony.
I think that's a fair assumption because the report came from...
It's not a question, and counsel's now testifying.
If I might just finish.
Okay, well, do you want to rephrase your question because it is leading?
May I have a little leeway with an expert witness? Well, I can certainly rephrase, Judge, sure.
Okay, please.
The report or the discussion that we're talking about, Exhibit 5, Madam Clerk, was provided by Mr. Owen to the prosecutor, who then provided it to me, who then provided it to you as part of his file.
Okay.
So did you assume that it was a description of the methodology?
Right, and it sounds like maybe I was not off base in assuming that. If that's the pedigree of the report, then it was presented with the idea that this form of methodology was going to be used in this case.
Yes,
so, right.
that's
okay?
correct.
I may have gotten it right then.
Yes.
Good.
Okay. The distillation of the 19 slides that we talked about today, I heard your testimony that it's something that you had worked on in an effort to make the science behind automated speaker recognition a little more clear to people that don't have a math background.
That was my hope. Whether or not I succeeded, only you can tell me.
Mm-hmm. And you sent it to me by email?
That's correct, sir.
All right. I don't know how long it took you to make it, but I just checked my email, and I got it yesterday afternoon. Do you have any reason to disagree with that?
No. But I've been worried about this since this Frye hearing started, which I think was over 10 days ago. I think this Frye hearing maybe started 10 days ago, and I've been worried about all this and what I've been hearing spoken about, and I've been thinking and putting this thing together during that time, because I think that we haven't been clear and haven't indicated a strong understanding of the scientific terms that we've been using in this case.
Mm-hmm. Do you know about how long you and Mr. O'Mara and myself have been in contact in connection with this case?
Yes, actually, I do. I think I received the first email. I was looking at that today. I think I received the first email from you on April 23rd. I was here in the UK at that time also for the International Standards meeting on biometrics, and I think you emailed me, and I think then we spoke on the phone from my hotel room in Hursley, England, on about the 24th of April, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Is that consistent with your recollection?
Sure. The report, though, that we've been talking about with regard to Dr. Alan Reich, do you have the release date, if you will, on that? Do you know when you got that in this time frame?
I received 2 copies of the report, two slightly different reports. One started out with the phrase, "This is incomplete." The second one had the date May 9th on it, and I did not get it from you May 9th. I think I probably got it about 10 days later. Could that be right? I could look through my email to determine when you sent it, but if I had to guess, it'd be around May 19th, I think.
Of this year?
Of this year, that's correct, sir.
A month or so, give or take?
A month before today, that's correct.
Right.
I've had it about a month.
Prior to having any contact with myself or Mr. O'Mara, you were aware of Mr. Owen's work in the case, I think you said?
No, sir, I didn't say that. I was aware of Mr. Owen. I was not aware of his work in this case. I've seen his website. I've heard about Mr. Owen. I've read things off of his website long before for the last few years, I've been aware that there was such a person, and he was doing forensic speaker recognition.
Thank you, Dr. Wayman.
Any recross?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Wayman. You may want to relay to him that we're going to disconnect the...
Dr. Wayman, we've finished with your testimony, so we're going to disconnect. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate it greatly. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, are there any further, not for tonight, but are there any further witnesses in regards to the Frye hearing that the defense wants to call? Okay, is the state going to want to call rebuttal witnesses?
One.
And when is that witness going to be available?
As soon as tomorrow.
Okay, I'd like to get to our group of 40.
The witness will be available either Tuesday or Wednesday, whenever the court tells us we want to continue this. That's fine.
Okay, let's try for Wednesday at 4.
Yes, Your Honor.
Is that sufficient for you? Will you please let the defense know, don't have to let them know right here in open court, but let them know who you intend to call as a rebuttal witness? Do you have the name of the person now?
Sure, Mr. Owen.
Mr. Owen?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll have him, do you anticipate, can you tell me some kind of a guesstimate as to how long you expect his testimony to be?
How long have we been here with this witness?
We've been here 4 hours,
Less
and
than-
the air conditioner goes off at 5.
I can't imagine it would take even a quarter of that time, Judge.
Okay, then, so you're saying you would be doing your part in an hour and then whatever the defense wants to do?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, we'll do that at 4 o'clock on Wednesday.
I would just, in the interim, I'll tender one case to the court. It's for counsel's, I don't know if the site is Casillas, C-A-S-I-A-S versus State. Citation is 94 Southern 3rd, 611. Second DCA case from June of 2011. I'll direct the court's attention to footnote 2.
Footnote 2, okay?
Are we going to argue this today?
No, we're not finished with the hearing. Okay, is there anything else that we need to take up today?
Yes.
Yes.
Only for housekeeping purposes.
Sure.
Judge, I have some exhibits that I'd like to introduce as a composite, only because I know the court asked for copies of the reports, but I don't know if they're actually in the record. So I have CVs and the reports, and I'm going to argue at the appropriate time the court reconsider some of the articles that were marked. And I have a digital exhibit for the court, which contains
Before we go any further, and I don't mean to cut you off, but could you let the state know what these are? There may be an agreement, and I can handle that issue tomorrow at any time. And if there's a disagreement, I can hear argument. I have to say it's 8:30. The air conditioner went off at 5. I've been sitting in this chair since 9 o'clock this morning, but for an hour at lunch and few breaks. I know that everybody else is tired. You have said so yourself. And we're reconvening court at 9 a.m. So if you don't mind, please let the state know what those exhibits are, and if there is an objection, I'll take it up tomorrow.
I just didn't want to miss my chance.
You're not going to miss your chance.
Thank you, Judge.
Okay, with that, court is in recess until 9 a.m.